Good evening, night owls, and welcome to WhisperCrowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Adrian, and I work as a security guard at Greenwood Cemetery in upstate New York, about 40 minutes outside of Albany. Unlike most cemeteries you might picture, this one is genuinely beautiful in an architectural sense. I know that sounds strange when talking about a place where people are buried, but each mausoleum here looks like a miniature Gothic cathedral, complete with intricate stonework and stained glass windows. Every headstone and ornament maintains the same aesthetic, creating this almost otherworldly atmosphere that feels more like walking through an outdoor museum than a graveyard. Unfortunately, not everything about this beauty is positive. Given the stunning craftsmanship and the presence of valuable materials like marble slabs, granite monuments, and bronze plaques, we've had problems with thieves who sneak in during the night to steal these items for resale. Families who have loved ones buried here pay extra for enhanced security, which is why instead of working alone, I patrol with 2 other guards. We make constant rounds to deter any opportunists who might think it's a good idea to rob from the dead. I've been working this job for nearly 4 years now, and while I was pretty spooked during my first few months, I eventually settled into a comfortable routine. I convinced myself that all those stories about cemeteries being haunted were just myths, old wives' tales meant to scare children. I had no idea how wrong I was. It was late April of last year, around 11:30 at night, and I was walking down one of the cemetery's main pathways. Tall mausoleums rose about 8 to 10 feet high on both sides of me, each one extending back 15 to 20 feet into the darkness. I kept my flashlight beam moving, checking corners and any spaces where someone might try to hide. The night was cold and still. The only sound was a gentle breeze whistling between the stone walls of the tombs. Then a sharp knock broke the silence. I stopped immediately and switched off my flashlight, straining my ears to figure out where the sound had come from. There was enough moonlight that I could see pretty clearly for several yards in any direction, but I couldn't make out any movement. And I heard it again, another soft, deliberate knock. I turned toward my left and realized the sound was coming from a particularly tall mausoleum about 30 feet ahead of me. My heart started racing as I walked slowly toward it, radio in hand, ready to call for backup or the police if things went south. I dealt with grave robbers before, and while they usually weren't armed, they could definitely get violent when cornered. I stopped in front of the mausoleum, my throat tight with anxiety, and tried to peer through the black iron gate that blocked the entrance. But it was impossible to see anything. The roof cast everything inside into deep shadow, and even the bright moonlight couldn't penetrate the darkness. I heard the knocking again, softer this time, and assumed that whoever was inside hadn't noticed my presence yet. I gripped my flashlight tighter and decided to take control of the situation. "Hey, what are you doing in there?" "Stop right now," I shouted with everything I had. My voice must have echoed throughout the entire cemetery, because I put all my fear and tension behind that yell. Anyone caught off guard would have jumped out of their skin hearing me scream like that, while a bright yellow light suddenly illuminated them. But the tall, dark figure standing at the back of the mausoleum, with its head down and forehead pressed against a marble slab, didn't even turn to look at me. Instead, it knocked once more against the stone with its forehead while I stood there, mouth agape, frozen in panic, and unable to respond to my colleagues' radio calls asking what had happened after hearing my shout echo through the night. Every nerve in my body was telling me that what stood before me wasn't human. I remained frozen as the figure slowly began to turn toward me. My flashlight trembled in my hands as this thing took slow, deliberate steps toward the exit, pressing its pale, withered hands against the iron bars like a prisoner trapped inside the tomb. It held my gaze, and I couldn't focus on anything except those ghostly hands. I couldn't make out any other features. That entity made me lose all self-control. I felt my legs turn to jelly and my arms tense up with pure terror. Then, suddenly, it spoke. "Open it." The voice of this being is impossible to describe. It was rough, deep, like it was speaking from its stomach rather than its throat. I can't explain it clearly, but I know what I felt the deepest, most intense terror I've ever experienced in my life. I dropped everything I was holding, flashlight and radio, and I ran. I ran and kept running like a madman until I reached the west entrance of the cemetery where one of my colleagues was stationed. He tried to calm me down, but it was useless. For the next hour, I sat trembling with fear inside the guard booth, and I even threw up when neither of them was looking. When I finally managed to calm down, my two colleagues had gathered together and asked me again what had happened. I could barely explain what I'd seen without having another panic attack. They looked at each other with concern and walked together toward that area of the cemetery. Every minute waiting for them to return was agony. I kept staring into the darkness around me, terrified that at any moment I might see that entity again, watching me from behind a tombstone. After about 20 minutes, they called me on the phone. "Hey, Adrian, there's nothing here." My heart sank, not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I thought that thing had managed to escape. I pressed myself against the wall of the security booth and kept watching the door nervously while listening to my colleagues tell me not to worry, that they wouldn't mention anything to the boss. When one of them returned with my radio and flashlight, I had to go back to work. Reluctantly, I continued patrolling the cemetery, though I avoided that area at all costs. I held my breath every time I passed near a mausoleum, terrified of looking inside those deep crypts and seeing that being staring back at me. I tried to convince myself that everything was resolved, that nothing like this would happen again. But when I heard a faint knocking several yards behind me, I ran like crazy again until I reached the east gate where my post was located. I didn't move from there until dawn, without a doubt the longest night I've ever spent on this job. The next day I talked to my girlfriend about what happened, and she convinced me that it could have been an elaborate prank by my colleagues. They'd never acted like that before. Both were older, serious, mature men, so I found it hard to believe they were capable of something like that. But after questioning them, they confessed that the second knock I'd heard was indeed one of them trying to scare me. I wanted to be angry with them, but at the same time, I felt relieved. So I asked them how they'd managed to get someone inside a sealed mausoleum, and which one of them had been the actor. Both fell silent before responding very seriously. "Adrian, we didn't do that." I got pretty upset and insisted they tell me the truth, that if they'd already confessed to the knocking, they could admit that the whole thing had been their idea and end the prank there. But they both swore on their daughters' and grandchildren's lives that they hadn't planned any of it. When they arrived at the scene, they found my radio and flashlight lying on the ground among several empty mausoleums. They checked them all but didn't see anything strange, so they assumed I'd imagined it all, that after working here for 3 years, my imagination had finally gotten the better of me. I told them the story again, and this time they seemed convinced that I'd experienced something real, though they couldn't explain exactly what. They advised me to avoid that area for a while, for my own good. I'll never forget what one of them told me. Don't go back there. You don't want something that's wandering around to become obsessed with you. These things happen sometimes in this business. That night, I worked pretty normally, though I kept hearing faint, distant knocking on marble. Specifically from that mausoleum I could see in the distance from my guard booth. A week passed, and I should mention that I have family buried in this cemetery. My grandmother and some uncles I cared about deeply when they were alive. On my day off, I asked my girlfriend to come with me to visit them. She reluctantly agreed, complaining about why I had to go to the cemetery on my day off when I spent every night there anyway. She soon understood my real intentions when, instead of going to my grandmother's grave, we took an alternate path toward the mausoleum that had been causing me so much fear. We arrived, and I shined my flashlight inside. It was empty, no flowers, no vases, no lit candles. The plaques were covered in dust, and the interior was quite dirty overall. Just marble and stone tombs, except for something in one corner, hidden in the darkness, a pile of small, yellowed bones. My girlfriend must have sensed something very wrong because she immediately stepped back and told me to contact the administration to have that tomb cleaned as soon as possible. I asked her why she was so nervous, but she didn't give me details until we left the cemetery. Once we were outside, she told me that those bones in the corner, though small and few, were very likely human remains. I listened to her and reported it to the administration. I don't know what they did afterward, but when I passed by 2 days later, the soft tapping on the slabs had stopped and the bones had disappeared. The mausoleum was clean. I'm left with this story for the rest of my life. I have no idea how those yellowed bones could have gotten inside that mausoleum without breaking the gate, but something was definitely connected to them. Someone, for good or bad reasons, had put them there to get rid of them. I hope I never have to experience anything like that again. But as my colleague told me, these things sometimes happen in this business. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Alexandra, and I'm a monument restoration specialist. I know it's not a well-known profession. Most people think cemetery workers are just groundskeepers and security guards. But there are also those of us who maintain headstones and mausoleums. I'm responsible for keeping marble, granite, bronze plaques, and other materials in good condition, especially in places where the monuments have historical value. Families sometimes hire me to professionally clean a loved one's grave in ways they couldn't do themselves, or cemeteries contract me when they want to restore sections that have fallen into neglect. I inherited this business from my father, and he inherited it from my grandfather. We're the only restoration specialists in our region of central Pennsylvania, so I never lack for work and do reasonably well financially. However, sometimes my profession exposes me to strange and unpleasant occurrences. There are certain graves that are, how should I put it, heavy. I want to make it clear that my work doesn't involve disturbing the rest of the dead. What I do is purely aesthetic, to make cemeteries look better and give monuments a more dignified appearance. But there are spirits who completely oppose this activity. Don't ask me why or how they make their displeasure known. I usually hear sounds unexplained knocking near the grave, whispers. Given the nature of my work, I'm often alone, so hearing a voice near me is already an indication that something unusual is happening. Large numbers of cockroaches and flies also start appearing. And yes, I know that might seem normal when you're cleaning a place like this, but you can tell when there's something else attracting them to the site specifically to bother you. At first, these situations made me very nervous, and my father had to handle them. But gradually, I lost my fear, and he explained that it often helped to talk to the deceased. I didn't understand what he meant until one day he took me to a particularly heavy grave where I actually felt someone pulling my hair during the entire hour. He spent polishing and restoring the broken parts of that stone monument. Throughout the whole time, he spoke to the deceased woman, telling her that everything was all right, that her family had paid to make her grave beautiful, that there was nothing wrong with what we were doing, and that she didn't need to worry. Then he started talking to her about her grandchildren and children, sharing news and updates. I was amazed to see that peace settled over that place during the hours we were there. I began applying the same approach, and sometimes it worked better than others, but it definitely helped, except for one occasion. Without a doubt, it was the most complicated job I've ever encountered. I won't say his real name for obvious reasons, but I'll call him Mr. Martinez. The thing is, Mr. Martinez wasn't buried in a conventional grave. His family had enough money to pay for their own mausoleum. It was quite beautiful, located in a large cemetery outside of Harrisburg. The family didn't want to be pessimistic, but the grandmother was already 98 years old, and well, nature eventually takes its course. Sometimes you have to be prepared. They wanted the mausoleum to be in excellent condition in case it needed to receive her. They explained that at the moment, only her deceased husband, Mr. Martinez, was inside. I accepted the job. They gave me the keys, and I went directly to the cemetery. Even though it was already 2 in the afternoon, I thought that since it was such a large tomb, it would be better to start right away. I arrived around 3:30. The mausoleum was at the end of a beautiful cobblestone path lined with gorgeous graves, and it had striking architecture with columns and arches, like something Greek or Roman. I'm no architecture expert, but I could recognize it was a beautiful building, at least structurally. Reality was that when I got closer, I began to notice the most obvious signs of neglect: withered grass and lots of weeds around it, the wooden door unlacquered, and moss accumulating between the stones. How long had it been since anyone had cleaned this place? It was implied that I would also do gardening and exterior maintenance work, but I never expected to find everything so deteriorated, especially since the cemetery was supposed to do basic maintenance. I went back to the administration office and only got evasive answers. They couldn't explain why the groundskeeping and cleaning crews always avoided that area. I soon discovered why. I returned down that path with all my work materials: brooms, cleaning products, trash bags. I opened the mausoleum door wearing a face mask, and God knows it wasn't intentional or meant to be dramatic. It was mid-July at 4 in the afternoon, and it was hot. But as soon as those rusted hinges gave way, I felt a blast of ice-cold air hit me that took my breath away and made me stagger. I quickly recovered, though I couldn't understand why it was so cold inside. I tried to turn on the lights, because theoretically, the mausoleum was connected to the cemetery's electrical grid. But I wasn't surprised when they didn't work. Another thing to complain to the administration about, but I resigned myself to doing it the next day. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and the scene was terrible dust and cobwebs like I'd never seen in my life. The mausoleum measured about 50 feet deep and 30 feet wide. It even had stone benches for visitors to sit on and vases for flowers. But saying things were in terrible condition would be an understatement. Vases were broken on the floor, and the ceiling lights had been torn out and hung precariously from a single wire. That explained the lack of lighting. At the very back, I could make out what I assumed had once been flowers, and in the center of the mausoleum, a marble niche. It took me nearly an hour to make my way through all the cobwebs, being careful that nothing would bite me, and I confirmed the identity of the sole occupant of that mausoleum. Antonio Martinez, beloved husband, father, and brother. The bronze and silver plaque had quite a beautiful engraving, though the epitaph was brief and lacking in sentiment. The photograph, on the other hand, somehow demonstrated the character of my client: cold, serious, expressionless. I placed my hand on the marble plaque, and suddenly I felt what I can only describe as an electric shock from my heels to the base of my neck, as if someone had pressed a live wire against my back. I let go of the marble plaque and quickly turned toward the mausoleum entrance. Hidden behind the door, with only his head and hands showing, I saw someone watching me. Although he was backlit and I couldn't make out who it was, I called out loudly, thinking it might be an employee or visitor. But when I went outside, there was no one there. At that moment I sighed and just asked God that this wouldn't be one of those heavy jobs. I finished opening the doors to let in as much sunlight as possible, and since I had little time left, I began sweeping up the dust and broken vases. I collected them in bags, and by the time I finished, it was already 6 in the evening. A guard shouted to me from a distance, without approaching the mausoleum, that they were clearing out visitors. I locked the mausoleum and went home. I returned very early the next morning with flashlights to illuminate the place properly, and I told the family they would need to hire an electrician. I was determined to leave that place spotless, since they had paid me well. I even brought oil so that opening and closing the doors wouldn't be such a struggle. It's funny, but the first bad sign of that long and torturous day was that even with oil, the door hinges resisted. I would even dare say they opposed me more than the day before. And how was the interior of the mausoleum? To my horror, someone, or rather something, had covered the floor of that place with dust and dirt, exactly as I had found it the day before. I felt my heart sink and slowly nodded, accepting that this job was going to be more complicated than it should be. However, I still had a solution. I began talking to Mr. Martinez just as my father had taught me. I told him I wanted to clean his mausoleum because his family wanted to visit him again, that I was just a guest. And all that while I swept up the mess again and began identifying the most deteriorated areas. I thought he was being receptive because for a couple of hours I had no problems. But at one point when I went outside to get the pressure washer, I saw a shadow move inside, and my instinct told me that despite my friendly tone and good intentions, I wasn't being welcomed. Door hinges creaked, and a deep, guttural whisper echoed through that long mausoleum. I'm not going to lie, I didn't understand what it said, but I know they weren't kind words. I seriously reconsidered whether to continue with that job or not, but I was already there and would at least do all the possible gardening work. I began mowing the grass, watering it, removing weeds, and everything necessary to restore the garden, while ignoring the whispers and knocking coming from inside the mausoleum. I was grateful it didn't have any windows, because I'm sure I would have seen someone watching me from inside more than once. The atmosphere was tense. I could feel it with every step I took. Something inside me kept telling me so. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was finishing up. I had brought wildflower seeds, and after scattering them, I tried to enter the mausoleum to get the 2 camping lanterns I had brought to illuminate the mausoleum. But when I picked them up, I felt the doors vibrating forcefully as if they were about to close. I stood firm and pretended not to be afraid, even though my legs were shaking with terror. It was like walking in a nightmare. Every step to the exit felt like carrying 1,000 pounds of sand on my back, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. As soon as I stepped down to the stone path leading to the mausoleum, I felt the door slam violently behind me, and both lanterns were burned out, every single LED destroyed. I don't know how I managed to control myself from crying. I took all my equipment and left that horrible place, understanding far too late a detail of vital importance. That place had years of abandonment, and most likely the family knew something they weren't telling me. The next morning I called my contact in the family, a son of Mr. Martinez whom I'll call Enrique. He was a mature man, about 20 years older than me, serious and quite reserved. I was afraid he wouldn't believe me, but as soon as I tried to talk to him, he instantly predicted why I was calling. He didn't let you claim it, did he? I was honestly speechless for a moment and asked if I could visit him. He said I was welcome anytime, so I drove directly to his house. He received me graciously, and I began explaining why it was impossible for me to finish the job he had commissioned. I promised a 70% refund since I could only do gardening and maintenance work outside the mausoleum, but he was very generous and told me it wasn't my fault. Then he confessed a difficult family story that's hard to believe. I won't go into details because that's no longer my story and it's not my place to share it. But Mr. Martinez was perverse, ruthless, and cruel. Very good at accumulating wealth, but terrible for the family. Apparently, his personality transcended death, and for the last 30 years, he had spitefully repelled any family member who visited the mausoleum, preventing them from cleaning it or doing any maintenance. Eventually they gave up, though they didn't know that the cemetery staff had also abandoned that task. That's why they sent me, hoping that a stranger wouldn't awaken Mr. Martinez's hatred. Unfortunately, they were wrong. I dared to suggest that they move his remains to another location. And although fortunately Mr. Enrique didn't misinterpret my intentions or take offense, he told me it was impossible. Mr. Martinez was attached to that place, and if they took it away from him, well, he would probably return to the family home or pursue some family member. It was better to leave him there, to let him be in peace, in solitude, as he always wanted to be. As for them, they would look for another place to put their loved one's remains when the appropriate time came. We said goodbye with a bittersweet feeling. Without a doubt, it was the darkest job I've ever had to undertake, and the first one I've had to give up on. I hope this scenario never repeats itself because of the sense of threat I experienced there, which will mark me for the rest of my life. My name is Julio, and I'm the night watchman at a cemetery in rural Oregon. I prefer not to say exactly where to prevent this story from attracting curious people who might disturb the peace of the deceased and mine, of course. I've been working here for about 12 years now, and honestly, it's a pretty quiet and relaxing job. Many people believe that cemeteries are full of supernatural events related to the remains of people resting here. While I can't deny that sometimes what I like to call troublemaker spirits show up, it's nowhere near as common as people think, nor does it last very long. The few times it has happened, the souls of the deceased barely make themselves known. They usually calm down as the months pass, and the paranormal activity gradually stops. Of course, I'm speaking from my personal experience. However, I can't deny that strange things happen in cemeteries, and this is where my story fits in. About 8 or 9 years ago, a flock of crows began taking up residence in the cemetery. They rest in the surrounding trees and green areas and generally don't cause any trouble. In fact, I've noticed they tend to eat the pests that get into the cemetery, like cockroaches and even rats. They're quite intelligent and can actually hunt. The visitors aren't very happy with their presence because they see them as bad luck, but I like them. Fortunately, the city council never did anything to drive them away. During my night rounds, watching for anyone who might have jumped the perimeter wall and was inside the cemetery, I could see them out of the corner of my eye, perched on crosses, headstones, and mausoleums, with their bright eyes fixed on me. They're just crows, or at least that's what I thought. The first time I heard them talk was one night in December. I think it was 2019. It was before the pandemic, I'm sure of that. It was cold that night, and I was wearing a pretty thin jacket, so I was having a rough time. Around 2 in the morning, I went to continue my rounds through the west side of the cemetery, and the crows were around in the vicinity. I could hear their cawing, and at one point after I sneezed, I clearly heard a voice to my left say, "Bless you." I was startled, assuming someone had gotten in and was right next to me. I jumped and shone my flashlight on the grave beside me. There was no one there, but I noticed a crow perched on the cross, staring at me intently. It let out a loud caw, and an instant later, a shrill voice came from it, "Bless you," explaining the level of horror I felt upon seeing and hearing that is impossible. My soul left my body, and I think I never lost control like that in my entire life. I ran as fast as I could, terrified by what I had just witnessed. I ran so fast I felt like I was floating until I reached the entrance. I locked myself in the security booth, looking outside with terror while searching on my phone for some logical explanation for what I had just experienced. Well, after a quick internet search, I discovered that crows can learn to talk. Or rather, they can learn to imitate sounds, words, and short phrases. That made me feel a little calmer. Maybe that crow had heard several people repeat that phrase. Although it's most common for them to learn to talk in captivity, it wasn't impossible for cemetery crows to learn to speak if they constantly heard visitors. I calmed down, and an hour later I went back out. I passed several graves and crows, but I didn't hear a single word more. Weeks later, around 8 o'clock when I was starting my shift, I stayed talking with the afternoon guard and told him what had happened to me. He laughed because he didn't know that could happen. That night was cold again, and I was doing my last round to get any lingering visitors out. There was fog, and as always, the crows were gradually appearing. The fog didn't let me see well, but my flashlight was powerful. However, that afternoon I felt something strange, like fear. I was restless with a deep feeling that something was about to happen. I heard the flapping of a bird as it landed on one of the graves. "So cold tonight," one of those crows was talking again. I stood firm to keep from running and stared at it intently, trying to identify some feature that would let me know if this crow was the same one from last time. Meanwhile, it returned my gaze, tilting its head every so often. I sighed, understanding that it was just an animal, and jokingly replied, "Yeah, pretty cold." I started getting nervous and kept walking down the path, trying to ignore everything that crow was cawing as I walked away. No one was left in the cemetery, and although I had convinced myself that they were just animals that had learned to imitate human expressions, I began to feel somewhat nervous when it was time to do my rounds. That same night, around 1 in the morning, I left the security booth and went into one of the paths, looking between the graves as always. cawing and flapping in the distance, and again a crow talking, but this time on top of a mausoleum. "I'm sorry, Sophia," said the crow. It's hard to describe how tense that moment made me and the anxiety I felt when I again saw the crow with its bright eyes fixed on me. I moved faster, and a couple of minutes later again. "Don't leave me, don't leave me." A crow perched on a grave was repeating the same plea. I remembered what I had read on the internet and understood that those were words they had been hearing from someone. They had been learning all of that, but from whom? Who spent enough time in the cemetery to teach crows such a wide range of words and expressions? The answer to my question came a few days later. I had arrived early one afternoon and stayed at the entrance talking with a coworker who did the engraving work. I'll call him David. At one point, a straggling family was leaving two young men accompanied by an elderly lady who was walking slowly with a black veil. That was a pretty common sight, and I didn't pay particular attention until I overheard their conversation. "Do you want to eat something, Grandma Sophia?" "Whatever you want." One of the young men, I assume her grandson, was trying to cheer her up with food, though she didn't seem to be paying attention. However, I stared at them with some amazement, clearly remembering what I had heard the crows say a few days before. David noticed and asked me what was wrong. I told him everything in detail, and he confirmed that the mausoleum where I saw that crow shouting, "I'm sorry, Sophia," belonged to that family. Although the first family member they buried there was that woman's husband. It was very recent, and that's why the lady went every day, though I never saw her because they usually left earlier. I was left alone for a while afterward, thinking about what I had just heard. I went out to do my rounds as always and heard the crows cawing in the distance. Scattered words, "I like it," "Merry Christmas," "dark." It became evident to me what was happening, and I finished confirming it when I heard a crow caw over the mausoleum. "I'm sorry, Sophia." The crows weren't monsters or demons. They're just very intelligent animals that were repeating what they heard. Voices from beyond that humans can rarely hear. Their caws enthusiastically repeat what the spirits cry out from the grave. Their laments, their desires, feelings of sadness, loneliness, or regret from many, and even jokes and mockery from others. In the afternoons and mornings, the crows remain silent, surely because they don't hear the voices of the deceased. So I understand they only respond to those voices during the night hours. During the last half of the decade I've worked here, I've gotten used to hearing them say any number of things. They never talk about me or refer to me, except once in mid-February last year. It was freezing, and again I made the mistake of not bundling up well. I passed by a fairly recent grave, and a crow cawed from nearby. "Bundle up, bundle up." That was too much of a coincidence, and I don't believe in coincidences. Someone was watching me, and the crow served as a bridge between the two of us. I never forgot my jacket again when it was cold. Without a doubt, they're quite intelligent and mysterious animals, capable of seeing, hearing, and feeling things that I cannot. That has allowed me to know that despite the calm that's felt in a cemetery at night, the reality is that there are always people crying, people talking, and people who, even if for a brief period of time, are there in the cemetery, watching me pass by while I keep guard. I'm a groundskeeper at a cemetery, and my job consists of keeping the common areas clean of weeds, making sure the grass is short at all times, and maintaining the flowers that decorate the pathways. Well, that's when visitors don't pull them up to put them on their loved ones' graves. Honestly, I spend more time replanting flowers than caring for them, and in autumn, all I do is rake leaves. It's just part of the job. My family moved to the United States when I was about 6 years old, back in 2009, and since then, we've lived in Vermont. I don't want to give my exact address, but it's a very beautiful and quite remote town, surrounded by forests and mountains. The cemetery is typical movie style, trees all around, lots of oval headstones with engraved crosses and short epitaphs. Far from being a terrifying place, it looks like a park with wide areas for families to gather. Since it's a daytime job, I've never worried about seeing ghosts, apparitions, or hearing sounds I would consider strange. Or rather, my ignorance led me to overlook the mysterious things I saw and assume many times that what I observed in the distance was just another visitor. But I was wrong. I've been thinking about how to tell this story for hours, and I think the best thing is to do it from the beginning. I turned 18 in 2021 and wanted to find a job quickly so I could buy a new car, go out with my girlfriend, and all that. When I found out there was a vacancy as a groundskeeping assistant at the cemetery on the outskirts of town, I went there immediately, praying that no one would take the job away from me. To my surprise, superstitions kept others from applying, and I was selected almost immediately. It was the middle of summer, and I was excited. An old groundskeeper named Harold taught me everything I needed to know. He was very quiet but helpful and kind. I had nothing to complain about. One day, like any other, while watching a few visitors come and go, I noticed something that caught my attention. Far away in an empty section, there was someone jumping, or rather dancing. I asked Harold about it, and with the indifference that always characterized him, he said, "Don't pay attention to her. She'll disappear in a bit." I learned pretty quickly that asking Harold for more answers than necessary didn't yield good results. I assumed it was a girl who went to that place to practice her dancing, and I let it go. As I said before, that cemetery was a quite beautiful natural place, and it made sense that if you could ignore the fact that it was a cemetery, you could enjoy some time in a peaceful place surrounded by nature, without music or many people around. Throughout the summer and part of the fall, I kept seeing her, always in the distance, dancing among trees and remote sections that no one ever visited. I felt curious, and more than once I approached carefully to see her better or maybe say hello, but it was impossible. When I thought I was finally close to her, she had actually disappeared. One autumn day, Harold noticed this, and with a quite serious tone told me not to follow her, not to try to chase her. I didn't dare contradict him or ask for an explanation. I simply nodded, and that ended that story. For 2 years, I continued working as his assistant until Harold retired, and I was promoted to head groundskeeper. The municipality hired a new assistant, and I've been working until today. From time to time, I heard giggles, footsteps, distant echoes of laughter, and even classical music, but I immediately assumed they were from visitors. The only thing that really managed to catch my attention was seeing the dancer leaping between graves and scattered trees. I asked some employees and the administration about her, but none gave me a satisfactory answer. They admitted to having seen her once in a while, but didn't know anything about her, except that they never saw her leave through the main gate. It was only when I had the opportunity to talk to the night watchman that someone told me something interesting. That girl has always been here, but no one remembers anymore. When I was little, my grandfather told me a horror story about a woman who danced among the graves, and that if you chased her, she would grab you by the legs and drag you to her tomb. The watchman was an older man, maybe Harold's age, so I knew that both he and Harold must have been aware of a legend I didn't know about. Now I should mention that I'm the type of person who likes ghost stories. That's why I listen to horror podcasts and consume any scary content I can find. But the content I like most by far is real stories, legends, those campfire tales that are passed down from generation to generation until they're lost. That's why I've spent time researching in libraries and records, past events, old legends, and things like that. It's a harmless hobby, something I do from time to satisfy my curiosity. And most of the time, I don't find anything in particular. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that in the same cemetery where I've been working for the last few years, there exists a very peculiar local legend that has been forgotten over the years. For me, it has always been a quiet, peaceful place, but about 100 years ago, the site carried a strange legend. Many visitors claim to have seen someone dancing among the graves, a young woman moving between headstones, doing turns and leaps like a ballet dancer. Of course, everyone was scandalized at that time. How dare she dance among the graves of the deceased? It was an outrage, a lack of respect. But when authorities tried to reach her to remove her from the cemetery, she would usually disappear into the surrounding forests. Gradually, the legend of the tormented soul of a ballet dancer grew, and everything got worse when a child disappeared around the 1940s. They said the child had chased her deep into the forest, and well, she took care of him. Keep in mind that the cemetery back then was smaller, so seeing her was much more common. But little by little, as the town grew, the cemetery expanded and people moved away. The legend died until finally, people like me began to mistake her for just another visitor. Now I knew the truth, and when I saw her, I had a deep desire to go confront her, to see her up close. I had never experienced anything paranormal, and that's why the idea of finally seeing if everything I had read and heard was true excited me. Well, let me tell you that all of this is real, and I'll never forget what I experienced in late 2024. For a year, I knew that supposed dancer I could see in the distance was some kind of specter, a tormented soul that the few cemetery visitors usually ignored. I struggled to follow Harold's advice from years ago with his cold and dry, "Don't try to chase her." But I couldn't stand it anymore. And one October afternoon while I was raking leaves, I had my opportunity. It was quite cold, and the fog didn't let me see too far. The cemetery was completely empty, just me, my assistant in another section, and the grave diggers who were at the cemetery entrance. All day I hadn't seen a single person walking among the graves, and that's why it really took me out of my thoughts to hear a feminine giggle nearby. I stopped immediately and looked around, but I only saw some trees, headstones, and small piles of dry leaves. Must be a visitor, I thought almost automatically, though I suddenly realized how stupid what I had just thought was. It was obvious that I was alone, and although the fog around me didn't allow me to see many yards beyond, I still knew that in the distance, crossing that green field full of headstones, she was there, dancing. I began walking toward the forest, being careful not to trip over the graves, and a strange feeling twisted my stomach when I heard that giggle nearby again. I was scared. I felt like I was getting into something I didn't understand. The fog lifted a little, and my heart sank when I saw her about 60 feet away, spinning on top of a headstone with inexplicable lightness and ease. She looked small, about 5 feet tall, had her eyes closed, and wore a dress of pale pink that seemed very old. I saw her in detail, frozen where I stood, her brown hair tied in 2 buns, and her pale white skin. Suddenly she stopped, standing on her tiptoes on top of the headstone. She made a curtsy, and before I could react, speak, applaud, or say anything, a terrible scream made me retreat in terror. I screamed loudly while she remained firm like a statue. I took several steps back, tripped over a headstone, and fell to the ground. Again, silence took over that cemetery, and I lay there looking at the sky as it darkened, afraid to move. The idea that anything I did might provoke a scream from that specter terrified me. But after a few seconds, I decided to look. I turned to look forward, and she was no longer on the headstone. I got up cautiously, looking around in case this was all just a prank by the administration or the grave diggers, who generally had a pretty dark sense of humor. No one was in that area except me and her, who was staring at me intently from behind a tree in the forest. She didn't stop looking at me, and I didn't dare move until the fog enveloped her. Then I began my journey back to the tool shed, running as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone anything at first because, well, let's say my friends and family are quite skeptical to the point that they would have thought about taking me to the doctor for a CT scan. However, when I had the opportunity to talk to the night watchman, I told him everything I had seen. He didn't seem surprised and confirmed that what I did was reckless. You don't know what kind of spirit she is, what intentions she has, or what sorrow keeps her in this world. Don't tempt her to do something to you. Unfortunately, I haven't seen Harold again, but I suppose he would have told me the same thing. Since then, I continue working at the cemetery, and I never followed the ballet dancer again. I also haven't spread the story around town, and this is the first time I'm telling it. I tried to research more about it to learn the identity of that girl and her story, but there was no way. There's nothing in the city records about that dancer, besides the legend, of course. As for her name, I tried to find it out by reading the oldest headstones in the cemetery, but I couldn't find anything in particular. There were at least 7 women who were dancers, 2 others who were dance teachers. Any of them could be the spirit I saw, though I suspect the youngest of them all. I won't say her name out of respect, but anyway, although I didn't find information about her past, something tells me it's her. Sometimes, especially in the afternoons or very early in the mornings, I see her dancing in the distance, far from curious eyes. But there's one more detail that I find particularly terrifying, particularly for me. Sometimes I see her stop, and although it sounds egocentric, I feel like she looks back at me. I promise I'll never follow her again, and I hope that someday she'll finish her performance and be able to rest. My name is Blanca, and this happened in my small town in rural Georgia, near Willow Creek. Growing up, my father would come home drunk every Friday after selling produce at the farmer's market in town. I don't have many happy memories from those days, because he would always beat my mother when he was in that state. She would hide us at my grandmother's house so we wouldn't see, but we could still hear the screaming through the thin walls. Both of my parents have been gone for years now, but I still remember those moments, and they make me want to cry. After several years had passed, I met my husband David and a woman named Margaret. At first, I thought she was a kind person. She would bring me food sometimes and stay to chat with me on the front porch. One afternoon in late summer, she asked me if I didn't trust my husband. I told her that, of course, I trusted him. Then she pulled out a small plastic bag filled with dark soil and a smooth black stone, telling me to place it under David's pillow. I hesitated at first because she wouldn't explain what it was for. Then she left, leaving me with that unsettling feeling in my chest. I was foolish to doubt my husband, but I decided to put the bag under his pillow anyway. Days passed, and I noticed that David was acting strangely. He wouldn't eat his meals and would wake up in the early hours screaming and drenched in sweat. He told me he was hearing voices and felt like something was watching him from the bedroom window. Worried sick, we went to see Dr. Henderson, who prescribed some antibiotics because he only found a throat infection. David was fine physically. He just needed to rest for a few days to recover. So he stayed home for 2 days, sleeping most of the time. However, exactly 1 week after I had placed that bag under his pillow, while I was taking a shower, I heard a terrifying scream from the bedroom. I rushed out, water still dripping from my hair, and saw my husband sitting on the edge of the bed, crying uncontrollably. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me he was hearing voices in his head, voices of people he didn't know, speaking nonsense to him. Minutes later, he calmed down and fell asleep. I returned to the kitchen to wash some dishes that had been left dirty from dinner. Outside, the Georgia night was pitch black, with only the sound of dogs barking in the distance and the chirping of crickets filling the air. When I finished washing the dishes, I went out to the backyard to collect the laundry I had left hanging on the line. But when I turned toward the bedroom window where my husband was sleeping, I saw a dark shadow entering through the glass. I ran quickly to see what it was, and when I entered the bedroom, my husband was still asleep. But at the head of the bed stood that shadow in the shape of a tall man, stretching his arm as if wanting to touch David's face. I screamed with all my strength, and my husband woke up with a start. He asked me what was happening, and I told him I had seen a shadow. He told me to lie down and try to sleep, but I was terrified. And that's how the night passed, with me lying awake, staring at the ceiling. Before dawn broke, my husband got up to shower, and I got up to prepare his lunch because he had to go to work at the lumber mill. But before reaching the kitchen, I could swear I saw a man sitting in our living room chair out of the corner of my eye. I ran to the bathroom and told my husband that something evil was in the house. He came out of the bathroom and tried to calm me down, telling me everything would be okay. Gradually, I calmed down, and then the sun came up. At approximately 11 in the morning, Margaret arrived and asked me about my husband's health. I told her he was getting worse, that we were experiencing strange things in the house. Margaret began talking about the nature of restless souls, mentioning that they initially frighten people and then disappear. I was very curious about the bag of soil she had given me, so I asked her about its contents. She explained that it contained soil from the old cemetery on Maple Street, a fragment of bone, and a stone. When I asked her why she had given me that, she mentioned it was so that my husband would stay with me forever. After this brief explanation, Margaret left without saying anything more. I felt disgusted by the bag, so I threw it far away to the other side of the yard toward Willow Creek. I felt somewhat relieved to get rid of that thing, but I was still worried about what was happening to us. That night, my husband came home as usual. We had dinner together, fried chicken and mashed potatoes, and then went to bed. In the early morning hours, something strange woke us up. We had to run out to the cotton field because we saw shadows emerging from Willow Creek in our backyard. I can assure you that I saw figures of children and women in long, old-fashioned dresses. We turned on the porch light before running, and we saw a little girl sitting on the ground, playing with the dirt. She wore a yellow dress that was very dirty, and her hair was full of soil and dry leaves. When she raised her face, her eyes were completely black, like pools of tar. Although we didn't want to pass through the old cemetery, there was no other choice if we wanted to reach help. While we were running down the dirt road, we heard laughter in the darkness. It was Margaret, who was among the tombstones shouting things about the devil and ancient curses. When we reached the cotton field, my husband and I stopped for a moment to catch our breath. We were exhausted and very confused, not understanding what was happening or why we were seeing these things. We decided to go to my aunt's house, which was about 2 miles away, to ask for help and spend the night there. When we arrived, we told her everything we had seen, and she listened to us carefully. She offered us her guest room for the night and prepared some sweet tea to calm our nerves. During the following days, we tried not to think much about what had happened, but it was difficult to forget those images and the sounds we had heard. We decided to talk to some people in town to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. When we spoke with the neighbors, we discovered that we weren't the only ones who had seen strange things in that area. One neighbor told us that she had seen shadows moving in her garden and that she heard laughter and whispers during the night. Another neighbor said he had seen a woman dressed in white walking near Willow Creek, and that when he tried to approach, the figure disappeared into the morning mist. My husband died 2 months later due to complications from diabetes, and Margaret never returned to the house. People say she died shortly after, but no one knows where she's buried or what happened to her body. They say that after learning of her death, people saw her walking through the neighborhood, heading toward a house near the town entrance. Folks comment that a witch used to live there many years ago. One day I was hanging laundry on the line, and I heard a whistle coming from the nearby woods. I saw an elderly woman in a long dark dress disappear into the ravine by Willow Creek. I never understood why I listened to that cursed old woman and brought witchcraft into my home. Some things are better left alone, and some people should never be trusted, no matter how kind they seem at first. My name is Mateo, and I'm from a small town in Northern California. What I'm about to share happened to me one night after spending several hours playing basketball with my friends at the local court behind the community center. That evening, my mother called me to say she would be arriving home later than usual after going downtown to pick up some prescriptions from the pharmacy. It was 9 o'clock at night, and since no one would be home, I told her I would stay out a little longer with my friends. I continued talking and laughing with my buddies, and at around 11 o'clock, everyone said goodbye and headed home in different directions. I walked toward my house, which is located near Riverside Cemetery, just past the old elementary school that closed down 5 years ago. I was listening to music on my phone through my earbuds when I suddenly began to feel a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. The night was calm, no rain or cold wind, just a normal autumn evening, but something in the atmosphere didn't feel right. The air seemed thicker somehow, and the usual sounds of the night seemed muffled. I continued walking, and when I reached the street that runs alongside the old cemetery, I felt like someone was following me. I looked back and saw a stray dog, which made me nervous because I thought it might want to attack me, although it was simply following at a distance, its eyes reflecting the streetlight. But when I turned toward the elementary school, where the entrances to both cemeteries are located, the old one from 1892 and the newer one from 1965, I heard a voice calling for help. The voice seemed to belong to a woman and was coming from the newer cemetery. It sounded desperate, almost pleading. With what little courage I had left, I decided to investigate since the cemetery gate was standing wide open, which was unusual for that time of night. I looked both ways down the empty street and turned on my phone's flashlight. The voice continued to echo from inside, and although I couldn't explain why, at that moment I felt compelled to follow the sound. Something about it seemed so genuinely distressed. So I entered the cemetery, trying to locate where the voice was coming from. I called out loudly, asking where the person was, and the voice responded, telling me to come closer. The words were clearer now, and I could make out what sounded like, "Please help me, I'm lost." I didn't experience fear at that moment. I only had the idea in my mind that someone genuinely needed help. I walked a few more steps, noticing how the sound became increasingly clear and seemed to be leading me deeper into the cemetery, past the older headstones toward the back section. Suddenly, a friend who had seen me enter the cemetery decided to follow me to play a prank. He surprised me from behind, grabbing my shoulders and shouting, "Boo!" I was so startled that I felt like I was about to faint. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He asked me what I was doing, and I told him about the woman calling for help. At first, he didn't believe me, but then he also heard the voice, clear as day. Although he was somewhat skeptical about the whole situation, he decided to accompany me to investigate further. We both heard it now, a woman's voice, strained and desperate, calling out for assistance. The silence in that place was almost absolute, except for that haunting voice. We went deeper into the cemetery, following that pained, desperate sound. The moonlight cast eerie shadows between the headstones, and our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the gravel path. Suddenly, the tone of the female voice changed dramatically, as if in an instant it had moved a great distance away from us. But there was something else different about it too. It had become lower, more guttural, less human. My friend told me we should leave, thinking that maybe it was a spirit, or even the legendary La Llorona that his grandmother used to tell stories about. I replied that such beings weren't real, trying to convince myself as much as him. But just when we were about to leave, the voice resonated again, this time much closer than we had heard it before. It was right behind us, breathing down our necks. Using the light from our phones, we discovered a dark silhouette just a few feet away from us. It might have been the fright or a trick of my vision, but that thing didn't seem to be touching the ground. It hovered slightly above the grass, swaying back and forth like it was floating. Fear paralyzed us both. I felt my legs become heavy, trembling like never before. That silhouette began approaching slowly, and we remained motionless, not knowing how to react. The air around us grew cold, and I could see our breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. After what seemed like endless seconds, we began to back away carefully. My friend whispered that we should jump the fence of the nearby school, while that figure continued approaching us, getting closer and closer with each passing moment. We took a few steps backward, until suddenly we heard a deep sigh right behind us. I turned around and saw a tall woman standing on top of a large tombstone, with her arms raised toward the sky. Her dress was white and seemed to glow in the moonlight, but her face was hidden in shadow. Both of us screamed, filled with terror and panic. We began running between the graves, trying to escape from these macabre figures. While we ran, we could hear their cries just a few feet behind us, but they were no longer human cries. They sounded like the wind whistling through broken glass, or the sound of metal scraping against stone. We never dared to look back. Fortunately, we were both fast runners and managed to escape. Once outside the cemetery, we didn't stop running until we reached my house. My legs were shaking so badly that I could barely stand upright when we finally stopped. When we arrived, we told my mother everything that had happened. She listened to us carefully and then told us that we shouldn't be in the cemetery at those hours of the night. Seeing our pale and frightened faces, she served us some hot chocolate to calm our nerves and made us sit on the couch while she called my friend's parents. While we drank the hot chocolate, we tried to explain to her what we had seen, although our words seemed insufficient to describe the fear we had felt. The experience had shaken us both to our core, and even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Since that night, I avoid passing by that cemetery. I prefer to take a longer route around the other side of town rather than go near that dark and terrifying place again. The memory of that night changed something in me, made me realize that there are things in this world that we cannot understand or explain. Unfortunately, I could never find closure to that horrible event. Who were they? Why were they there? Why were they calling to us specifically? I think these are questions that will never have answers, and maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. This happened in the year 2017. I live near Oakwood Cemetery in a small town in Ohio, and I had never witnessed anything out of the ordinary before. My name is Ulysses. One night, I went out to hang around with my friends at the local diner. We stayed there talking and laughing until it got very late. Between conversations and jokes, it became 2 in the morning, so I took my backpack and headed home on foot as always, with my earbuds in, thinking about getting home soon to shower and rest. As I approached the street that runs alongside the cemetery, there's a dark section where the street lamp has never worked properly. It's common to see people drinking there, or sometimes homeless folks seeking shelter. I passed through that area, and suddenly someone stepped into my path. I removed my earbuds and greeted them, saying good evening politely. I couldn't see clearly in the darkness. I could only make out a figure standing on the sidewalk. The person seemed hunched over, leaning heavily on something that looked like a walking stick. I stepped aside to continue walking, but that figure also moved in the same direction, blocking my path again. I asked what they wanted, and then I heard a woman's voice. the voice of an elderly woman who asked me for help getting to her house. She said she lived close to where I lived, somewhere on Elm Street. It seemed strange to me how she said it, because I had never heard anyone speak so slowly, and as if they had no energy left in their body. Her words seemed to drag, like she was speaking through water. So I decided to help her, and we began walking together. As we stepped out of the shadows and under the next working streetlight, I could see that she was indeed an elderly woman wearing a dark burgundy shawl with intricate embroidery. It covered most of her face, and she wore a long black skirt that seemed to drag on the ground. I didn't see her feet, or rather, I didn't pay attention to them at first. The woman appeared to have difficulty walking, so I took her by the arm to steady her. I had never felt an arm so thin and fragile. It was like holding a bundle of twigs wrapped in paper-thin skin. She thanked me with a very soft, whispery voice. Then we walked slowly and began to converse. She told me she lived alone, that her youngest son was in California working in the tech industry, and that it had been a very long time since he had left. She also mentioned that she had been born a long time ago. I asked her what year she was born, but she said she couldn't remember anymore. Then she commented that she found it strange how I dressed and asked why I had such long hair, even though my hair was actually quite short, barely touching my collar. As we continued down the sidewalk, the elderly woman began telling me that it had been many years since anyone had visited her, and that she often felt very lonely. I felt sorry for her listening to this, but I also began to feel uncomfortable because of her strange way of expressing herself. Her words seemed to come from somewhere far away, and sometimes she would pause mid-sentence, as if she had forgotten what she was saying. When we were just a few yards from the entrance to Oakwood Cemetery, the woman mentioned that she was close to her home now. This surprised me quite a bit, since she had mentioned living on a street near mine, which was in the opposite direction. Suddenly, the light from the cemetery's entrance lamp went out completely, plunging us into total darkness. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I noticed that the thin arm of the woman seemed to be thickening, as if it was changing shape under my grip. It felt like the bones were shifting and growing. Without thinking, I immediately let go of her arm and told her I was going to get out my phone's flashlight. I opened my backpack to look for my cell phone, my hands trembling as I searched through my things. When I turned on the flashlight, I saw the woman's face just inches from mine. She had somehow moved much closer without me noticing. Her face was not normal. Her skin was stretched tight against her skull, almost like a mummy, or like someone who had been sick for a very long time. Her eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, and her lips were cracked and colorless. I backed away quickly, and she asked me if I wanted to come into her house. She raised her arm, and I could see that she was holding an old-fashioned oil lantern that definitely hadn't been there before. She pointed toward the cemetery entrance with her other hand. My legs froze with fear as I realized what was happening. She removed the shawl from her head, revealing a black rosary hanging around her neck and her head that was almost completely bald, with just a few strands of gray hair clinging to her scalp. Her skull was visible through the thin patches of remaining hair. She began to laugh in a disturbing way, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind, or like someone trying to laugh with no air in their lungs. At that moment, the entrance lamp flickered back on, casting an eerie yellow glow over everything, and she was gone. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of old flowers and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of the funeral home where my grandfather's service had been held. Without hesitation, I ran as fast as I could until I reached my house. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I arrived, I told my mother and my cousin, who was visiting, what I had witnessed. My mother, annoyed that I had stayed out so late, scolded me for being on the streets at that hour. But when she saw how shaken I was, she told me to light a candle as a sign of respect for the spirits. I followed her advice and lit a white candle, hoping that it would calm whatever negative energies I felt surrounding me. From that night on, I have never walked alone through that area again. What impacts me most about that experience is that I felt like I had accompanied something that was not of this world back to the cemetery where it belonged. It was as if I had been chosen to guide a lost soul home. But the soul had been lost for so very long that it had forgotten how to be human. Every time I think about that moment, I feel chills run down my spine, and it reminds me that there are things we cannot completely explain. There are forces and presences that exist alongside our world, sometimes intersecting with our lives in ways we never expect. My life changed after that night. Now, I always make sure to be accompanied when I go out late, and I avoid passing through dark and solitary places. I've learned that some encounters are meant to teach us about the mysteries that surround us, even if we never fully understand their purpose. The boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond is thinner than most people realize. And sometimes, we find ourselves walking along that boundary without even knowing it. Good evening. My name is Rogelio, and I work as a night watchman at Maplewood Cemetery in my community. I've been doing this job for 9 years now. People always ask me if I don't feel afraid, or if I've witnessed strange things during my shifts. I tell them that I'm already accustomed to being surrounded by graves, and that I don't scare easily. I'm a calm person who enjoys the peace and quiet, so this work is ideal for me. I've experienced many peculiar situations during my nightly rounds. Hearing laughter, crying, and murmurs is something routine for me by now. However, something truly surprising must occur for it to actually impress me anymore. After 9 years of working in a cemetery, you think you've seen everything. About 6 months ago, when I arrived for my shift, which runs from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, my day shift partner mentioned that someone had been vandalizing one of the headstones. He said they had painted something on it during the previous night. I went to check it out and found drawings of a small house and a smiley face carved into the marble. It was the grave of a young child, but it was very neglected, without flowers, and it seemed like no one had visited it in a very long time. It made me very sad to see it in such a state, so I brought some flowers from the maintenance shed and cleaned the headstone a bit. The name on it read Timothy James Morrison, age 7, beloved son. That night, everything proceeded without any incidents, and I almost forgot about the little grave. The following night at work, I went out to make my usual rounds around 10 o'clock, but I felt drawn to visit Timothy's grave again. To my surprise, the flowers I had left were gone, and there was a new drawing on the headstone. This time it was a stick figure of what looked like a little boy holding hands with a taller figure. I thought my day shift partner was playing a prank on me, since he had done similar things before, and I didn't entirely trust his sense of humor. After finishing my initial round, I returned to the entrance guardhouse, turned on the radio to a late-night talk show, and ate the dinner my wife had prepared for me, a turkey sandwich and some potato chips. Around 2 in the morning, drowsiness began to overcome me. My eyes were half closed when I looked toward the window that faced a section of newer graves. Suddenly, I saw something dash past very quickly between the headstones. It was small and moved with the quick, erratic movements of a child. I decided to do another round, thinking it might be a vandal, a drunk person, or some teenagers trespassing to cause trouble. With my heavy-duty flashlight in hand, I checked every corner of the cemetery methodically. I reached an area we call the spiral, because the graves are arranged in concentric circles around a large oak tree that's been there for over 100 years. The air there always feels different, thicker somehow, and much colder than the rest of the grounds, even in summer. When I arrived at this section, I saw a child from behind, wearing a red sweater and a brown knitted cap. I called out, asking who he was and what he was doing there, but the child kept walking without saying a word. He moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going, but his steps were silent on the gravel path. I can't deny that my whole body was trembling with fear. This was different from anything I had experienced before. I approached a little closer, being very careful, and was about to tap his shoulder to get his attention. But at that precise moment, the child disappeared. I can swear to you that he simply vanished right before my eyes, like smoke dissipating in the wind. From the shock, I dropped my flashlight, and the batteries scattered across the ground, leaving me without any light. I tried to find them by feeling around in the darkness, but the area was very dark because the large oak trees blocked most of the moonlight that filtered down from above. Suddenly, from the far end of the cemetery, I heard a child's lament echoing through the night air. The voice was calling for his mother over and over again. "Mama, where are you? Mama, I can't find you." The sound was heartbreaking and filled with such loneliness that it made my chest ache. I stood completely still, paralyzed by terror, and began to sweat despite the cold night air. Without thinking twice, I ran as fast as possible toward the entrance, stumbling over small headstones and memorial decorations in my haste to get away. When I reached the guardhouse, I looked at the clock and saw that there were still a few hours left until my shift ended. I tried to relax and calm my nerves, but that event left me very disturbed. At dawn, before leaving for home, I decided to make one final walkthrough to ensure everything was in order, and to prove to myself that what I had experienced was real. When I passed near Timothy's grave, I noticed something extraordinary. The soil around the headstone had been disturbed, as if small hands had been digging in it. And there, written in the loose dirt with what looked like a child's finger, was a single word: lonely. That image was burned into my memory, impossible to forget. I'm not the only one who has had these experiences with Timothy. My day shift partner has also seen the same child walking among the graves during his occasional overtime shifts. He told me that on one occasion, while doing a late afternoon check before I arrived, he saw the boy from behind, wearing the same red sweater and brown cap. He tried to speak to him, but the child didn't respond and simply walked away slowly toward the older section of the cemetery. My partner followed him, but at a certain point, the the boy just disappeared without leaving a trace. He also told me that one evening, while he was organizing paperwork in the office, he heard laughter and small footsteps near the main entrance. He went out to investigate, thinking some child from the neighborhood had entered the cemetery grounds, but he found no one. However, he did notice that several small toys had appeared near Timothy's grave: a red rubber ball, some toy cars, and a stuffed teddy bear that looked very old. Both of us began to notice that during our shifts, we often saw things that couldn't be easily explained. Shadows that moved quickly between the trees, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere in particular, and of course, the recurring figure of the little boy. These experiences led us to investigate more about the history of our cemetery, and in particular, about Timothy's tragic story. We asked longtime residents and elderly people in the area, who told us heartbreaking stories about the child. Apparently, Timothy had died in a car accident many years ago, around 1985, and his mother, devastated by the loss, visited his grave every single day for years. She would bring fresh flowers, clean the headstone, and sit there for hours talking to him as if he were still alive. However, as time passed and grief took its toll, the visits became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether when his mother moved away to live with relatives in another state. The grave was gradually forgotten by everyone except the maintenance crew, and even they only gave it basic care. My partner and I decided to take special care of Timothy's grave. We began cleaning it regularly and placing fresh flowers there every week. Despite the fear we sometimes felt, we also had a kind of compassion for the boy and wanted to do something meaningful for him. Each time we passed by his resting place, we noticed small changes. Toys would be rearranged, flowers would be moved to different positions, or sometimes we'd find small drawings scratched into the soft earth. One particularly quiet night during one of my rounds, I brought a small white candle and lit it in front of Timothy's headstone. As I did so, I felt a kind of peace that I had never experienced before in that place. I stayed there for a while in complete silence, and I felt as if the child was somehow grateful for our attention and care. From that night forward, we began lighting a candle every evening at his grave. Although the strange experiences continue to this day, we now feel that in some way we're helping Timothy's spirit find the peace it has been searching for all these years. Sometimes, I wonder if he's still looking for his mother, or if he's just lonely and wants someone to remember that he existed. Either way, we've made it our mission to ensure that Timothy Morrison is never forgotten again. The job has taught me that death doesn't always mean the end of someone's story. Sometimes, the love and care we show for those who have passed can make a difference, even when we can't fully understand how or why. Timothy may be gone from this world, but his presence in that cemetery reminds us all that every life, no matter how brief, has meaning and deserves to be remembered with kindness. I used to work as a night watchman at Riverside Cemetery in a small town outside of Chicago. This was back in 2018, during one of the toughest periods of my life. I'd been out of work for months after the factory closed down, and I was desperate for any kind of employment. My buddy Jake had been working cemetery security for a couple of years, and mentioned they needed another guard because the place was massive. Over 200 acres of rolling hills and old oak trees. To be honest, the idea of spending my nights alone in a graveyard didn't exactly thrill me. The pay wasn't great either, $12 an hour, but it was steady work with benefits, and I needed both. The cemetery had been having problems with teenagers breaking in to party, and sometimes worse groups would use the remote sections for drug deals. The management wanted to beef up security, especially during the winter months when the early darkness gave people more cover. My first few weeks went smoothly enough. I'd drive the perimeter in my pickup truck, checking the gates and making sure no one had cut through the chain-link fence that surrounded the newer sections. The old part of the cemetery, dating back to the 1800s, had this beautiful wrought iron fence that was more decorative than secure. But it was in a more visible area near the main road. It was a Tuesday in late November when everything changed. The weather had been brutal that week, freezing rain mixed with sleet that made the roads treacherous and kept most people indoors. I remember thinking it would be a quiet night because of the storm. Around 3 in the afternoon, I got the call that there would be a funeral that evening. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of a local factory owner, had passed away at 91. The Whitmores had been prominent in town for generations. They donated the money for the new library and had a whole section of the cemetery dedicated to their family plots. The funeral was scheduled for 5 o'clock, which meant I'd need to be there early to help with crowd control and assist the funeral home staff. I arrived at 4:30 to find the parking lot already filling up despite the weather. Mrs. Whitmore had been involved in every charity and civic organization in town, so the turnout was huge. The funeral director, a thin man named Peterson whom I'd met a few times, briefed me on my duties. I was to help carry the casket, and then position myself near the grave site to keep an eye on things. The service was held in the old section of the cemetery, where the Whitmore family mausoleum stood on a small hill overlooking the rest of the grounds. It was an imposing structure made of gray granite, with carved angels flanking the entrance and the family name etched in large letters above the door. Mrs. Whitmore was to be buried in a plot next to her husband, who had died 5 years earlier. As the mourners gathered around the grave site, I took my position about 20 feet away, near a cluster of old headstones dating back to the 1920s. The minister, an elderly man with a trembling voice, began the service. The weather seemed to match the somber mood. The sky was dark gray, almost black, and a cold mist hung in the air. That's when I first saw it. At first, I thought it was just another mourner who had wandered away from the group. About 50 yards behind the main gathering, near a section of particularly old graves, I caught sight of a figure dressed in black. Nothing unusual about that at a funeral, of course, but something about the way it moved caught my attention. It seemed to glide rather than walk, and it appeared to be unusually tall and thin. I kept watching out of the corner of my eye while trying to focus on the service. The figure moved between the headstones with an odd, floating motion that made my skin crawl. When I turned to get a better look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The thing had wings. Not like a bird's wings, but massive, dark wings that seemed to absorb the dim light around them. They weren't fully extended, but folded back like a cloak. The figure itself was tall and gaunt, dressed in what looked like a long black coat or robe. Where its face should have been, there was only shadow. I blinked hard, thinking the poor lighting and stress were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there, standing motionless among the graves like it was observing the funeral from a distance. My hands started shaking, and I had to grip my flashlight tighter to keep from dropping it. I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but all the mourners were focused on the minister's words. Even Peterson and the other funeral home staff seemed oblivious. The winged figure remained perfectly still throughout the rest of the service, watching from its position among the old graves. When the time came to lower Mrs. Whitmore's casket into the ground, I helped carry it to the mechanical lift that would lower it into the vault. That's when the thing moved closer. It approached to within about 30 feet of the grave site, close enough that I could see more details. The wings were definitely there, huge, black, and feathered like a raven's, but proportioned for something much larger. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, and its presence seemed to create a pocket of deeper cold in the already frigid air. But I wasn't the only one who could see it. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, was standing with her mother near the front of the crowd. She kept tugging on her mother's coat and pointing in the direction of the winged figure. The child was getting increasingly agitated, making little whimpering sounds and reaching up to be picked up. Her mother kept shushing her and trying to redirect her attention to the service, clearly embarrassed by the disruption. The little girl's distress was growing more obvious by the minute. She kept pointing at the exact spot where the dark figure stood, her eyes wide with what looked like terror. Finally, her mother picked her up and carried her away from the grave site, apologizing quietly to the people around them. As soon as the child was removed from the area, the winged figure began to move again. It circled around the outer edge of the gathered mourners, always staying in the shadows between the older headstones. Its movement was hypnotic and terrifying, completely silent and eerily smooth. When we finally finished lowering the casket and began to disperse, I looked for the figure one last time. It was gone. I searched the area where I'd last seen it, but found nothing, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed grass, nothing to indicate anything had been there at all. The mourners left in small groups, their black umbrellas disappearing into the parking lot like a flock of ravens. Soon, Peterson and his staff were packing up their equipment, and I was alone in the cemetery as darkness fell. That night was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made me jump. I kept my flashlight on continuously and stayed in my truck as much as possible. I couldn't shake the image of those massive black wings, and the way the figure had watched the funeral with what seemed like predatory interest. I never saw the winged figure again during my time at Riverside Cemetery, but I never forgot it either. I did some research later and found references to similar sightings at cemeteries around the world. Dark, winged beings that appear at funerals and are sometimes called angels of death or psychopomps in folklore. Some cultures believe they guide souls to the afterlife, while others see them as harbingers of doom. I don't know what I saw that day, but I'm certain it wasn't human. Maybe it was there for Mrs. Whitmore to escort her to whatever comes next. Or maybe it was drawn by the gathering of grief and sorrow. All I know is that some things exist just beyond the edge of our normal perception, waiting in the shadows of places where life and death intersect. I quit the cemetery job 3 months later and never looked back. My name is Marcus, and I worked as a security guard at Greenwood Memorial Gardens, one of the most exclusive private cemeteries in Atlanta. This was back in 2019, and the place was where all the old money families buried their dead. We're talking marble mausoleums that cost more than most people's houses, bronze statues imported from Italy, and landscaping that looked like something out of a magazine. I was hired as the third night watchman because the cemetery was enormous. Nearly 300 acres spread across rolling hills on the outskirts of the city. The pay was decent, $22 an hour, and the benefits were solid. My two colleagues, David and Tommy, had been working there for years and knew every corner of the place. On my first day, they gave me the standard orientation about patrol routes, radio procedures, and what to do if we caught trespassers. But then they pulled me aside for what they called the unofficial briefing. "There's something you need to know about the Hartwell Mausoleum," David said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "It's in the northeast section. Can't miss it. Looks like a little Victorian house with stained glass windows. 2 little girls are buried there. Twins who died in a car accident back in 1987. Tommy nodded grimly. Their names were Sarah and Sophie Hartwell. They were only 6 years old. Sometimes at night, you'll see faces in the windows of that mausoleum. Just ignore it and keep walking. Don't investigate, don't shine your flashlight on it, and whatever you do, don't try to get closer." I appreciated the heads up, but honestly, I didn't buy into ghost stories. I'd always been a skeptical person, and I figured they were just trying to mess with the new guy. I'd worked security at a shopping mall before this, and every job has its urban legends that the old-timers like to share with newcomers. "Thanks for the warning," I said with a smile, "but I think I'll be fine." David and Tommy exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read. "Just remember what we told you," David said. "Some things are better left alone." My first few nights were completely uneventful. I did 3 patrol circuits each shift, one at midnight, one at 2:30, and one at 5 in the morning. The cemetery was peaceful and well-maintained, with motion sensor lights along the main paths and emergency call boxes every few hundred yards. It felt more like patrolling a fancy park than a graveyard. I didn't even know which mausoleum David and Tommy had been talking about until my 4th night on the job. I was making my midnight rounds when I spotted it. A small, house-like structure made of pale stone with intricate Gothic revival details. It had a steep slate roof and 2 small stained glass windows that caught the moonlight beautifully. A bronze plaque near the entrance read, "Hartwell Family, 1950–2019. I was admiring the craftsmanship when I saw something that made me do a double take. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a small face pressed against one of the stained glass windows. It was there for maybe 2 seconds before disappearing. My rational mind immediately kicked in. It had to be a reflection or a trick of the light. The windows were old and the glass was textured, which could easily create optical illusions, especially at night. I kept walking, making a mental note to mention it to David and Tommy later. But as I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found myself glancing back at the Hartwell Mausoleum several times, and each time I did, I thought I caught glimpses of movement behind those windows. The next night, I made sure to approach the mausoleum from a different angle, thinking maybe the lighting was creating the illusion. But as I walked past, I saw them clearly this time. Two small faces, pale and indistinct, watching me from behind the stained glass. They were positioned at exactly the right height for children, and they tracked my movement as I walked by. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to keep walking normally. I didn't want to give in to paranoia or imagination. When I reached the end of my patrol route, I circled back to check again. The faces were gone. This became a nightly occurrence. Every time I passed the Hartwell Mausoleum during my rounds, the two faces would appear in the windows. They never seemed threatening, just curious, like children watching the world go by from their bedroom window. But it was deeply unsettling nonetheless. I started timing my routes differently, sometimes approaching from various directions or changing my schedule slightly. It didn't matter. Sarah and Sophie, because by now I was convinced that's who they were, always seemed to know when I was coming. They would appear in those windows like clockwork, watching me pass with what seemed like desperate longing. After 2 weeks of this, I finally worked up the courage to mention it to David and Tommy. Their reaction confirmed my suspicions. "So you've seen them too," Tommy said with a knowing nod. "Every guard who's worked here has reported the same thing. It's been going on for decades." "What do they want?" I asked. David shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. Some of the guys think they're just lonely. Others believe they're trying to communicate something. The day shift supervisor says their parents have only visited the grave 3 times since the burial, once for the funeral, once on the first anniversary, and once about 10 years ago. That information hit me hard. I couldn't imagine losing children and then being unable to visit their resting place. Whatever had kept the Hartwell parents away, guilt, grief, or just the inability to face their loss, those little girls seemed to be waiting for them. The faces in the windows continued to appear nightly for the next 3 months. I got used to it, even started to feel a strange sort of companionship with Sarah and Sophie. They were part of my routine now, as normal as checking the gates or walking the perimeter. Then on a Tuesday in late March, something changed. I was making my midnight round when I noticed a car parked near the Hartwell Mausoleum, a dark blue sedan with Georgia plates. As I approached, I could see 2 people inside the small structure. A man and woman, both in their 50s, were kneeling in front of the burial plaques with flowers and what looked like small stuffed animals. The woman was crying softly, and the man had his arm around her shoulders. They stayed for nearly 2 hours, talking quietly to the graves and arranging the gifts they'd brought. It was clear they were the parents, finally finding the strength to visit their daughters after more than 30 years. When I made my rounds that night, I approached the Hartwell Mausoleum with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. For the first time since I'd started working there, the windows were empty. No small faces pressed against the glass, no sense of being watched. The mausoleum felt different, peaceful in a way it hadn't before. I never saw Sarah and Sophie again. The windows remained dark during all my subsequent patrols, and the eerie feeling of being observed was gone. It was as if their vigil had finally ended. David's theory made sense to me. Those little girls had been waiting all those years for their parents to come back, appearing in the windows night after night in hopes that one of the figures walking past might be the people they missed most. Once their parents finally visited and said their proper goodbyes, Sarah and Sophie were able to rest. I worked at Greenwood Memorial Gardens for another 8 months, before taking a day job with the city. But I never forgot those two small faces in the stained glass windows. Sometimes the dead aren't haunting us out of malice or unfinished business. Sometimes they're just waiting for love to find them one more time. I worked night security at Hillcrest Memorial Park in suburban Detroit for almost 3 years. It was a decent job, $15 an hour with overtime opportunities, and the work was generally peaceful. My partner was an older guy named Frank who'd been doing cemetery security for over a decade. Frank knew every inch of that place and had plenty of stories about the weird things that happened after dark, but I mostly took them with a grain of salt. Hillcrest wasn't one of those ancient graveyards you see in horror movies. It was established in the 1960s and served some of the wealthier suburbs north of the city. The plots were expensive, and many of the people buried there had been successful business owners, doctors, and old automotive industry executives. It was the kind of place where people were buried with expensive jewelry and watches, which should have been our first warning about what could go wrong. The story takes place in October of 2020, during the height of the pandemic, when everything felt surreal and dangerous. Frank and I were working 4 nights a week each, and the cemetery had been eerily quiet for months. Funerals were smaller, visitations were limited, and fewer people were coming to visit graves during the day. On a Thursday night around 11:30, Frank and I were sitting in the security office near the main entrance, playing cards and sharing a thermos of coffee. The office was a small trailer with windows facing the main drive, and we could see most of the cemetery's entrance area from our desks. We had walkie-talkies and a direct line to the local police. But in 3 years, the most exciting thing we dealt with was teenagers spray painting a few headstones. That's when we heard the noise. It started as a rhythmic scraping sound coming from somewhere deep in the cemetery, beyond the range of the security lights. At first, I thought it might be a maintenance crew working late, but Frank checked the schedule and confirmed that no work was supposed to be happening. Could be kids with shovels trying to scare each other, Frank suggested, but his voice carried a note of concern that I hadn't heard before. We decided to investigate. Frank grabbed the larger flashlight while I took the portable radio, and we set off into the darkness. Hillcrest was laid out in a grid pattern with paved roads connecting different sections, so navigation was straightforward even at night. The scraping sound was coming from Section D, one of the newer areas where plots were still being sold. As we got closer, the sound became more distinct, definitely metal hitting dirt, over and over again. Frank held up his hand to stop me when we were about 50 yards away, and we crouched behind a large memorial statue to observe. 3 men were working frantically around a fresh grave, using shovels and what looked like a small pry bar. Even in the dim light, it was obvious what they were doing. They were digging up someone who had been buried recently. One of them held a flashlight while the other 2 dug, and their movements had the desperate intensity of people working against time. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "They're robbing a grave." I felt sick to my stomach. I'd heard about grave robbing in history books, but seeing it happen in real life was deeply disturbing. These weren't desperate people stealing food. They were violating someone's final resting place for profit. "We need to call the police," I said, reaching for my radio. "Wait," Frank said, grabbing my arm. "Look at them. They're not teenagers or drug addicts. These guys look organized." He was right. The 3 men were working with the efficiency of people who had done this before. They had proper digging tools, a system for removing dirt, and one of them was clearly acting as a lookout. This wasn't a prank or a spontaneous crime. It was a professional operation. All the more reason to call for backup, I said, but before I could use the radio, the lookout spotted us. He shouted a warning to his partners and started running in our direction. In the beam of our flashlight, I could see he was holding something in his hand, something that caught the light like metal. "Run!" Frank yelled. We took off toward the main entrance, but the three men were faster and clearly knew the cemetery layout better than we'd expected. They cut us off near Section B, and suddenly we found ourselves surrounded. The leader, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, was holding a pistol pointed directly at Frank's chest. The other two flanked us, both carrying what looked like knives or short clubs. "You guys picked the wrong night to be heroes," the leader said. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "Now you're going to sit down, shut up, and let us finish our work." They forced us to sit on the ground while they used zip ties to secure our hands behind our backs. The leader took our radios and cell phones, smashing them under his boot heel. Throughout all of this, the other two men never said a word. They just watched us with cold, professional detachment. "Whose grave were you digging up?" Frank asked. Leader laughed. "Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, buried Tuesday with about $50,000 worth of jewelry, according to our source at the funeral home. Her family wanted to send her off in style." He made air quotes around the phrase, his voice dripping with contempt. For the next hour, we were forced to watch as they completed their grim work. They dug down to the concrete burial vault, used portable jacks to lift the heavy lid, and then hauled up the casket itself. The smell that emerged when they opened it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sweet and rotten, and completely overwhelming. Mrs. Kellerman had been buried in an elaborate dress covered with diamond brooches, pearl necklaces, and gold bracelets. The thieves worked quickly, stripping the jewelry from the corpse with practiced efficiency. They even took her wedding ring and dental work that contained gold. "Family put another 10 grand worth of stuff in the casket," one of them said. "Watches, more jewelry, even cash. These rich people don't think about what happens after the funeral." When they were finished looting the body, they forced Frank and me to help them lower the casket back into the vault and fill in the grave. The whole process took nearly 3 hours, and by the time we were done, the sun was starting to come up. "Here's how this is going to work," the leader said as they prepared to leave. "You two never saw us tonight. If you report this, we know where you live and we know where your families live. Frank, your granddaughter goes to Jefferson Elementary, right? And Marcus, your wife works at the bank on Maple Street. It would be a shame if something happened to them because you couldn't keep your mouths shut." The specific details about our families made it clear they'd been watching us and planning this for a while. These weren't random criminals. They were part of an organized operation that had done their homework. After they left, Frank and I sat in stunned silence for a long time. Eventually, we managed to work our hands free from the zip ties and made our way back to the security office. The phone there was still working, but neither of us reached for it. "We can't report this," Frank said finally. "These guys aren't bluffing. They know too much about us." I wanted to argue, but I kept thinking about my wife Sarah and our 2 young daughters. Leader had mentioned details that only someone conducting surveillance would know. Reporting the crime might be the right thing to do, but it could also put our families in danger. We decided to stay quiet and hope that no one would discover what had happened to Mrs. Kellerman's grave. The dirt had been carefully replaced and would look normal within a few days. Unless someone had a reason to exhume the body, the theft might never be discovered. For the next week, Frank and I continued our normal shifts, but both of us were jumpy and paranoid. Every car that drove past the cemetery, every unexpected sound, made us think the thieves were coming back. We barely spoke to each other, and the easy camaraderie we'd shared was gone. Then, On the following Thursday night, exactly 1 week after the robbery, Frank came running into the security office with terror written all over his face. He was shaking so badly he could barely hold his flashlight, and his skin had gone completely pale. "I saw her," he gasped, collapsing into his chair. "Saw who?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Mrs. Kellerman. She was walking through Section D, heading toward the main road. She turned around and looked right at me, Marcus. Right at me." I tried to convince Frank that he was imagining things, that the stress of the previous week had gotten to him. But the fear in his eyes was real, and his description was too specific to dismiss as hallucination. She was wearing the same dress they buried her in, but it was all torn and dirty from the digging. And she wasn't walking normal, she was kind of floating, like her feet weren't touching the ground. When she looked at me, her eyes were completely black. Frank refused to finish his shift that night. He went home and never came back to work. I called him the next day, but he'd already spoken to the cemetery management and quit without notice. I was assigned a new partner, but before he started, I worked one more night alone. Around 2 in the morning, I decided to walk through Section D, partially to prove to myself that Frank had been seeing things, but also because I felt like I owed it to Mrs. Kellerman to check on her grave. When I got there, I found something that made my blood run cold. Dirt over her grave had been disturbed again, but not by shovels. It looked like something had pushed up from underneath. There were what appeared to be handprints in the soft earth, as if someone had clawed their way out of the ground. I got out of there as fast as I could and spent the rest of my shift in the security office with the doors locked. The next morning, I was scrolling through local news on my phone when I found a story that made everything click into place. 3 men had died during the night in separate incidents across the Detroit metropolitan area. All 3 deaths were being investigated as homicides, but the police had no suspects and no obvious connections between the victims. I recognized their names from the driver's licenses the grave robbers had dropped at the cemetery. The leader, Robert Kowalski, had been found dead in his apartment with no signs of forced entry or struggle. The other 2, Brian Mills and Tommy Escobar, had died in their respective homes under similar mysterious circumstances. The police were baffled because there was no evidence of how the men had been killed. No wounds, no poison, no obvious cause of death. The only common factor was that all 3 had died at approximately the same time, around 2:30 in the morning. I never saw Mrs. Kellerman's spirit myself, but I was convinced she had somehow tracked down the men who violated her grave and taken her revenge. 3 days later, I submitted my resignation and found a new job in a completely different field. Some people are so attached to their possessions that they'll do anything to protect them, even after death. Mrs. Kellerman had been buried with those jewels for a reason, and she wasn't about to let thieves take them without consequences. Justice doesn't always come from the courts or the police. Sometimes it comes from places much darker and more final than that. I worked as a night watchman at Salem's Rest Cemetery in Massachusetts, one of the oldest burial grounds in New England. The cemetery dates back to 1692, established during the witch trials, and it's exactly as eerie as you'd expect from a place with that kind of history. Weathered slate headstones lean at impossible angles. Ancient oak trees cast twisted shadows across crumbling monuments, and the whole place has an atmosphere of accumulated sorrow that's almost tangible. This was in 2021, and I'd taken the job primarily because it paid well for what seemed like simple work. $18 an hour to walk around a historic cemetery a few nights a week seemed too good to pass up. especially since I was between jobs after finishing my master's degree in history. The irony of working in such an old cemetery while studying the past wasn't lost on me. Salem's Rest covers about 40 acres on the outskirts of the city, and it's divided into distinct sections based on when people were buried. The oldest section, dating back to the colonial period, is where you'll find the slate headstones with death's heads carved into them and epitaphs warning about the brevity of life. The Victorian section, added in the 1800s, features elaborate monuments and small mausoleums. The modern section, still in use today, looks like any contemporary cemetery. But it's the crypts that make Salem's Rest unique. Built into a hillside in the oldest section are 6 stone crypts, each one housing multiple burials from some of the area's founding families. The Mather Crypt, the Blackwood Crypt, the Prescott Crypt, names that appear on street signs and historical markers throughout the region. These structures were built in the early 1700s and sealed permanently in the 1920s when the last family members were interred. The crypts are substantial stone buildings, more like small houses than typical burial vaults. Each one has heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, and all of them have been locked for nearly a century. The keys are held by the few surviving family members, most of whom live in other states and rarely visit. According to the cemetery's historical records, some of these crypts contain the remains of over 20 people each, representing centuries of family lineages. My supervisor, an elderly man named Robert Crane, who'd been managing Salem's Rest for over 30 years, gave me the standard orientation about patrol routes and basic maintenance duties. But toward the end of our meeting, he mentioned the crypts almost as an afterthought. "You'll probably hear things at night," he said casually, not looking up from the paperwork he was organizing. "Sounds coming from the old crypts, like people talking or moving around inside. Every night watchman we've ever hired reports the same thing within their first week." I assumed he was joking or testing my reaction. "What kind of sounds?" "Voices, mostly. Sometimes it sounds like conversations, sometimes like whispers. Never anything you can make out clearly, but definitely human voices. The acoustic properties of those stone chambers can play tricks on you. Maybe it's just wind or settling, maybe it's something else. Either way, don't worry about it and don't investigate. Just do your rounds and file your reports." Has anyone ever opened the crypts to check? Mr. Crane shook his head. The families would have to give permission, and they're not interested in disturbing their ancestors. Besides, there's never been any evidence of actual break-ins or vandalism. Whatever's causing the sounds, it's not living people. On my first night, I didn't hear anything unusual. Salem's Rest was actually quite peaceful after dark, with well-maintained paths and adequate lighting in the main areas. The crypts were located in the oldest section where the lighting was minimal, but my flashlight provided plenty of illumination for the standard security checks. It was on my third night that I first heard the voices. I was making my 1 o'clock round, walking along the path that curves past the 6 crypts, when I became aware of a low murmuring sound. At first, I thought it might be coming from the road beyond the cemetery, maybe late-night traffic or people talking as they walked by. But as I got closer to the crypts, it became clear that the sound was coming from inside one of the stone buildings. The Blackwood Crypt, third from the left, seemed to be the source. I could hear what sounded like multiple people having a quiet conversation. The voices were indistinct, but definitely human, rising and falling in the natural rhythm of speech, with occasional pauses that suggested people were listening and responding to each other. My rational mind immediately started working through possible explanations. Maybe the stone construction was somehow channeling sounds from outside the cemetery. Maybe there were teenagers hiding somewhere nearby, and the echo was making it seem like the voices were coming from inside the crypt. Maybe it was just the wind moving through cracks in the old stonework. But as I stood there listening, the conversations became more animated. I could hear what sounded like laughter, and occasionally one voice would rise above the others, as if someone was making a point or telling a story. It was exactly like being outside a house where a family gathering was taking place, completely normal except for the fact that it was coming from a sealed stone building that had been locked for nearly a century. I followed Mr. Crane's instructions and didn't investigate further. I completed my round and made a note in my log about minor acoustic anomalies near the historic crypts, which seemed like a professional way to describe something that defied logical explanation. The voices became a regular part of my routine. Not every night, but frequently enough that I started to anticipate them. Usually, it was the Blackwood crypt, but sometimes I'd hear similar sounds coming from the Mather or Prescott crypts as well. The conversations always sounded friendly and social, never angry or distressed. If I hadn't known better, I would have assumed that families were gathering inside to visit and catch up with each other. After about 3 weeks on the job, I worked up the courage to ask Mr. Crane about the history of the families buried in the crypts. He was happy to share what he knew, and some of the details he provided gave me chills. The Blackwood family, for instance, had been among the most prominent merchants in colonial Salem. They'd owned several ships and had made their fortune in the trade routes between New England and the Caribbean. But they were also known for their large family gatherings and elaborate dinner parties. Historical records described them as an exceptionally close-knit clan who gathered frequently for holidays, business meetings, and social events. They were famous for their hospitality, Mr. Crane explained. The Blackwood house was always full of relatives, business partners, and friends. Even after they started dying off in the 1800s, the surviving family members would hold regular memorial dinners and family reunions. It was like they couldn't bear to be separated, even by death. This information cast the voices I'd been hearing in a different light. If the Blackwood family had been so devoted to gathering together in life, maybe that tradition had somehow continued after death. Over the following months, I began to notice patterns in when the voices occurred. They were most frequent on weekends and around holidays times when living families traditionally gather. The conversations were always most active during the hours when people would normally be socializing, typically between 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning. I also realized that the voices only occurred on nights when there had been a funeral at Salem's Rest during the day. It was as if the arrival of a new resident somehow triggered activity among the long-term occupants of the crypts. Maybe they were welcoming the newcomer, or maybe the presence of grieving families during burial services awakened something that had been dormant. The most dramatic incident happened on a Saturday night in late November, around Thanksgiving. There had been a large funeral that afternoon for a local businessman who had died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The service had been well attended, with over 200 mourners, and the burial had taken place in the modern section of the cemetery. During my midnight round, I found that all 6 crypts were active simultaneously. The sound was remarkable, like a neighborhood block party, where every house was hosting its own gathering. I could hear distinct conversations coming from each crypt, voices overlapping and blending together in a symphony of social interaction that had been going on for centuries. I stood in the center of the crypt area and listened to what sounded like the largest family reunion in history. Voices of men, women, and children echoed from the stone buildings, sometimes laughing, sometimes speaking in serious tones, always engaged in the kind of animated conversation that happens when people who care about each other come together. But that night, something was different. For the first time since I'd started working at Salem's Rest, I could actually make out individual words. From the Blackwood crypt, I heard a woman's voice say clearly, "Welcome, James. We've been expecting you." The name James matched the businessman who had been buried that afternoon. James Morrison, age 58, survived by his wife and 3 children. Somehow, the families in the crypts knew about the new arrival and were extending their hospitality beyond the boundaries of death. I stood there for nearly an hour, listening to what sounded like an enormous welcoming party for James Morrison. Different voices took turns speaking, and I got the impression that various family patriarchs and matriarchs were introducing themselves and their lineages. It was like a supernatural version of the social rituals that happen when someone new moves into a close-knit community. Eventually, the conversations began to wind down, and by 2 a.m, the crypts had returned to their usual silence. I completed my rounds in a daze, trying to process what I had witnessed. The next morning, I did some research on James Morrison and discovered something that gave me goosebumps. His genealogy, available through online family history sites, showed that he was a distant descendant of one of the families buried in the Prescott crypt. His great-great-great-grandmother had been a Prescott before marrying into the Morrison line in the 1860s. The families in Salem's Rest weren't just welcoming a stranger. They were welcoming home a long-lost relative. I continued working at the cemetery for another 6 months, and the voices became a source of comfort rather than fear. These weren't angry or restless spirits. They were families maintaining their bonds across centuries, continuing the social traditions that had defined their lives. Every new burial brought fresh conversations from the crypts, as if death was just another room in a house where extended family members could visit and catch up. When I finally left Salem's Rest to take a teaching position at a local college, I found myself missing those nightly conversations. There was something profoundly moving about knowing that love and connection could survive even the ultimate separation of death. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I think about the families in those crypts still gathering, still talking, still welcoming new members into their eternal community. It changed my entire perspective on death and what might come after. We spend so much time fearing the end, but maybe for some people, death is just the beginning of the longest family reunion in history. I never told Mr. Crane about the specific conversations I'd overheard or my theory about the family connections. Some mysteries are more beautiful when they remain unexplained, and some communities are too sacred to disturb with too much analysis. But I know what I heard in those crypts, and I know that death doesn't always mean goodbye. Sometimes it just means joining a conversation that's been going on for centuries, in voices that echo through stone and time, keeping the bonds of family alive long after the last breath has been drawn. I'm not entirely sure if what happened to me was paranormal, but I can tell you it's the strangest thing I've ever experienced. It haunts me to this day, and I've never found a satisfactory explanation. This happened back when I was just 5 years old at Greenwood Cemetery in a small town outside of Albany, New York. It was a crisp October afternoon, and my family had gathered to clean our relatives' graves before the winter set in. The cemetery was old, dating back to the 1800s, with weathered headstones and twisted oak trees that cast long shadows across the grounds. I was helping my grandmother pull weeds from around my great-grandfather's headstone when an elderly man approached us. He was tall and lean, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to twinkle with some inner knowledge. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world. "Hello there," he said to my grandmother, tipping an imaginary hat. "Beautiful day for remembering our loved ones, isn't it?" My grandmother smiled and nodded politely. Then the man looked down at me with those penetrating eyes. "And what's your name, young man?" he asked. "Samuel," I replied, suddenly feeling shy. His face broke into the warmest smile I'd ever seen. "Well, what do you know? That's my name too, Samuel." He extended his weathered hand to shake mine. "Pleased to meet you, Samuel." My grandmother seemed to recognize him then, though she didn't say from where. She introduced us properly, and after chatting with her for a few minutes, the older Samuel asked if I'd like to take a walk with him through the cemetery. My grandmother, who was usually very protective, simply nodded her approval without hesitation. We strolled together between the headstones, and he told me stories about life, about growing up, about the importance of family. He spoke about things that seemed far too mature for a 5-year-old to understand, yet somehow I did understand every word. He talked about choices and consequences, about being kind to others, about staying true to yourself even when it's difficult. "Life is a journey, young Samuel," he said as we paused beside a particularly old grave. "And sometimes we meet people along the way who help guide us, even when we don't realize it at the time." He had a way of speaking that made me feel important, like I was having a conversation with an old friend rather than a stranger. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made the cemetery feel less eerie and more peaceful. After about 30 minutes, he walked me back to where my family was working. He shook my hand again, that same warm smile on his face. "Take care of yourself, Samuel," he said, "and remember what we talked about." Then he simply walked away, disappearing among the headstones and oak trees. Years passed, and I occasionally thought about that afternoon. When I was around 12, I asked my grandmother about the man who had shared my name. She looked at me with confusion. "What man, honey?" "The older Samuel," I explained. "The one who took me for a walk in the cemetery when I was little. You seemed to know him." Her brow furrowed. "Samuel, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't remember anyone by that name, and I certainly don't remember you walking off with a stranger." I was puzzled but let it go, assuming she had simply forgotten. Years later, when I was in high school, I brought it up again during a family dinner. This time I asked both my grandmother and my mother about the incident. "I don't recall anything like that," my mother said slowly. "And there's no way I would have let you wander off with someone we didn't know well, especially in a cemetery." My grandmother shook her head in agreement. "I'm sorry, dear, but I have no memory of this person you're describing." That's when the strangeness of the situation really hit me. This man had known my name before I told him. He had the same height and build that I would eventually grow into as an adult. And most unsettling of all, my family had no memory of him whatsoever, despite the fact that they had clearly interacted with him that day. I've thought about it countless times over the years. Who was that man? Why did he seem so familiar with the cemetery, walking through it like he belonged there? And why did my usually cautious family allow me to walk away with a complete stranger? Sometimes I wonder if Samuel was his real name, or if he simply chose to share mine for reasons I'll never understand. Sometimes I wonder if he was even real at all, or if he was something else entirely. Perhaps a glimpse of my own future, or a guardian of some kind watching over a lonely child in a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin. I'm 32 now, and I still visit that cemetery occasionally. I always hope I might see him again, might get some answers to the questions that have followed me all these years. But I never do. The oak trees are still there, the old headstones still stand. But the man who shared my name has never returned. Or maybe he was never really there at all. A few years ago, I lost both of my in-laws in a devastating car accident on a remote stretch of highway outside of Phoenix, Arizona. The whole ordeal was a nightmare from start to finish. But what happened while we were waiting at the small-town mortuary still gives me chills whenever I think about it. The accident happened on a Sunday evening in late November. My husband's parents were driving back from visiting relatives in Tucson when their car hydroplaned on a rain-slicked curve and rolled several times. The local sheriff called us around 11 p.m. with the news that would change our lives forever. The tiny desert town where the accident occurred had limited facilities. The autopsies had to be performed in a makeshift examination room that had been set up in a small building adjacent to the local cemetery. It wasn't exactly the sterile, professional environment you'd expect, but it was all they had. We drove through the night to get there, arriving around dawn on Monday. The paperwork and legal procedures seemed to drag on forever. By late evening, we were exhausted, heartbroken, and still waiting for the final reports that would allow us to take my in-laws home for burial. The mortuary staff had long since gone home, leaving us waiting outside in the desert air with one of my husband's coworkers, Dave, who had driven down to support us. The temperature had dropped significantly after sunset, and the wind carried that particular chill that only the desert can produce at night. It was around 3 a.m. when we saw them. A couple walked slowly through the cemetery gates, which I could have sworn were locked. They moved with a peculiar, deliberate gait, as if they were in no hurry to reach their destination. The woman wore a long, flowing dress that seemed to billow in the wind, while the man was dressed in what looked like a dark suit. My husband, ever the polite Midwesterner, called out a greeting. "Evening," he said, raising his hand in a friendly wave. The couple acknowledged him with subtle nods of their heads, but continued walking deeper into the cemetery without speaking. There was something oddly formal about their movements, almost ceremonial. Dave suddenly grabbed my husband's arm. "How did they get in?" he whispered urgently. "The gates are chained shut after dark." We all turned to look back toward the entrance. Sure enough, the iron gate stood closed with a heavy chain and padlock clearly visible in the moonlight. There was no other way into the cemetery. It was surrounded by a high stone wall that would have been impossible to scale quietly. When we looked back toward where the couple had been walking, they had simply vanished. One moment they were there, moving between the headstones, and the next they were gone. There were no large monuments or mausoleums they could have hidden behind. No trees or structures that would have concealed their exit. The temperature seemed to plummet another 10 degrees in that instant. The wind died completely, leaving us standing in an unsettling silence broken only by the distant hum of the mortuary's generator. We stood there scanning the cemetery grounds for several minutes, calling out to see if they needed help or were lost. There was no response, no movement, nothing. When the cemetery caretaker arrived at 6 a.m. to unlock the gates, we told him what we had witnessed. He was a weathered man in his 60s who had worked there for over 20 years. He listened to our story with a knowing smile, then chuckled softly. "Ah, you met our regular visitors," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "They show up a few times a year, always around 3 in the morning. Been doing it for as long as I've worked here." "But how do they get in?" Dave asked. "The place is locked up tight." The caretaker shrugged. "That's just it, they don't need to get in. Harold and Margaret Wessington died in a car accident back in 1978, right out there on Highway 60. They're buried in Section C, Plot 27. Every now and then, they take their evening stroll, just like they used to when they were alive." He pointed toward the area where we had last seen the couple disappear. "They always walk the same path from the gates to their plot and back, harmless as can be. Some folks find it comforting, knowing that love doesn't end just because life does. At the time, we were so consumed with grief and exhaustion that the full impact of what we had experienced didn't really hit us. It wasn't until weeks later, after the funerals and after life had settled into a new, painful normal, that I truly understood what we had witnessed that night. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but I can't explain what we saw. 3 separate people witnessed the same thing. A couple walking through a locked cemetery, appearing and disappearing without a trace, on the anniversary of their own tragic death. Sometimes I find myself thinking about Harold and Margaret Wessington, wondering if they know they're gone, or if they're still living out some echo of their former life. I think about my in-laws, buried now in a cemetery back home, and I wonder if love really is strong enough to transcend death. I'd like to think it is. In a world full of sorrow and loss, maybe some things are eternal after all. Something strange happened to me during the Day of the Dead celebration in 2018, and I still can't make sense of it. Most people expect ghostly encounters to happen at night, shrouded in darkness and mystery. But this occurred in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people, which somehow made it even more unsettling. I was visiting San Antonio, Texas, for their annual Dia de los Muertos festival at the historic San Fernando Cemetery. The place was absolutely packed, with families celebrating their loved ones, mariachi bands playing traditional songs, and vendors selling everything from sugar skulls to marigold garlands. The atmosphere was festive and joyful, exactly the opposite of what you'd expect for a supernatural encounter. My 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, had been captivated by the elaborate costumes and face paint throughout the day. She was particularly fascinated by a group of women dressed as Catrinas, the elegant skeletal figures that are such an important part of Mexican culture. These performers were posing for photos with visitors, their faces painted like beautiful skulls, wearing flowing dresses and ornate headdresses. "Mama, can I get a picture with one of them?" Sophia asked, tugging on my sleeve and pointing toward the performers. I looked around and spotted 2 Catrinas near the cemetery entrance, both wearing stunning black dresses with intricate silver embroidery. But Sophia was pointing in a different direction, toward the older section of the cemetery. "I want a picture with that one," she insisted, indicating a third Katrina who was walking slowly through the crowd toward the back of the cemetery. This woman was different from the others. Her dress was pure white instead of black, and her face paint was more elaborate, almost ethereal. She moved with a grace that was mesmerizing, as if she were floating rather than walking. Even from a distance, there was something magnetic about her presence. "Okay, Mija, let's go catch up with her," I said, taking Sophia's hand. We followed the woman through the crowd, weaving between families gathered around graves decorated with photos, candles, and offerings of food and flowers. The mariachi music grew louder as we walked deeper into the cemetery, making it difficult to call out to the performer. "Excuse me," I shouted over the music. "Could we get a photo?" The woman in white didn't seem to hear us. She continued walking at that same measured pace, her long dress trailing behind her like mist. We quickened our steps, but somehow she always seemed to stay just ahead of us, no matter how fast we moved. The path led us to the oldest section of the cemetery, where the elaborate Victorian-era mausoleums stood like small houses for the dead. This area was less crowded, with fewer decorations and celebrations. The woman walked toward a section I hadn't noticed before, a small area with simple stone markers where cremated remains were interred. "Wait," I called out again, but when we rounded the corner of a large marble monument, she was gone. I looked around frantically. The area was essentially a dead end, backed by the cemetery's outer wall. There were only a few small stone pillars marking the cremation sites, nowhere that someone could hide or quickly exit. "Where did she go?" Sophia asked, looking as confused as I felt. An elderly man tending to a nearby grave looked up at us with curiosity. "Can I help you folks?" he asked in a kind voice. We were following a woman in a white dress, I explained. "A Katrina performer. She was just here a second ago." He scratched his head and looked around the empty area. "I've been here for the past hour, and I haven't seen anyone matching that description. You sure you didn't see one of the other performers?" My heart started racing. "No, she was right here. She walked right past you." The man shrugged apologetically. "Sorry, ma'am. I think you might be mistaken." Feeling increasingly uneasy, I took Sophia's hand, and we walked quickly back toward the main celebration area. I needed to confirm what I had seen, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. We found the two Katrinas we had seen earlier, still posing for photos near the entrance. I approached them while they were taking a break. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was wondering about your colleague, the woman in the white dress." The two women looked at each other with puzzled expressions. "What woman?" the taller one asked. "There's just the two of us today. We're the only Katrina performers hired for the festival." "But I saw her," I insisted. "She was wearing a white dress instead of black, and her face paint was different, more elaborate." The shorter woman shook her head firmly. "No, Senora, we've been here since morning, and we're the only ones. Maybe you saw someone in a regular costume. A lot of people dress up for the celebration." But I knew what I had seen. This wasn't someone in a regular costume. This was a full Katrina ensemble, professional and elaborate. The woman had moved with the trained grace of a performer, and her makeup was far too sophisticated for an amateur. Sophia and I left the cemetery shortly after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had followed someone who wasn't quite there. The way she had moved, the way she had vanished, the way no one else seemed to have seen her, it all pointed to something beyond the ordinary. Later that evening, I did some research about the San Fernando Cemetery and discovered something that made my blood run cold. In 1923, a young woman named Isabella Morales had died of tuberculosis at the age of 24. She had been a performer in the local theater, known for her grace and beauty. According to the records, she was buried in the cremation section of the cemetery, exactly where we had lost sight of the woman in white. Her obituary mentioned that she had been scheduled to perform as a Katrina in the Day of the Dead celebration the year she died, but passed away just 3 days before the festival. I believe we followed Isabella that day, still trying to make it to her performance after all these years. Still dressed in the white costume she never got to wear, still moving with the ethereal grace that had made her famous in life. The Day of the Dead is supposed to be a time when the veil between worlds grows thin, when our departed loved ones return to celebrate with the living. I think Isabella just wanted to finally take part in the festival she had missed so long ago. Sometimes the dead don't rest, sometimes they dance. The cemetery where my family is buried sits on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, about 30 miles north of San Francisco. It's an old place, established in the 1860s, with sections that seem to cascade down the hillside like stone terraces. The constant ocean wind whistles through the cypress trees, creating an almost musical backdrop that can be both beautiful and haunting, depending on your state of mind. My parents died when my siblings and I were young, a house fire that took them both when I was only 7 years old. My aunt and uncle, Sarah and Robert, took us in and raised us as their own. They made sure we never forgot where we came from, taking us to visit the family graves at least once every 2 months. It was their way of keeping our parents' memory alive, of making sure we understood our roots. Our grandparents were also buried there, in the oldest section of the cemetery, where the headstones date back to the Civil War era. And there was our little sister, Emma, who had died of pneumonia when she was just 2 years old, 3 years before the fire that claimed our parents. Every visit followed the same ritual. We would start with our grandparents in the historic section, then move to our parents' graves in the main area, and finally end at Emma's grave in the children's section at the far edge of the cemetery. This last section was set apart from the rest, surrounded by a low stone wall and shaded by ancient oak trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. None of us liked spending time in the children's section. There was something about it that made us all uncomfortable, something that went beyond the natural sadness of seeing so many small graves. We would clean Emma's headstone, leave flowers, say a prayer, and leave as quickly as possible. The reason for our unease became clear during our very first visit. As we stood around Emma's grave, we heard them, the voices of children talking somewhere nearby. Not crying, not screaming, just talking. Casual conversation, like kids playing in a schoolyard during recess. At first, we assumed the sounds were coming from houses in the surrounding neighborhood. The cemetery was built on a hillside, after all, and there were residential streets on several sides. But as the months passed, and we continued to hear the voices during every single visit, we began to realize something was wrong. The children's section was isolated. Unlike the other parts of the cemetery, which bordered busy streets and housing developments. This area backed up against a steep ravine. The nearest houses were at least 200 yards away, far too distant for us to hear normal conversation. And yet, every time we visited Emma, we heard those voices. Sometimes 2 or 3 children. Sometimes what sounded like an entire classroom. My Uncle Robert always tried to rationalize it. "Sound travels funny up here," he would say. "It's probably kids playing in the neighborhood below." But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he would glance around nervously when the voices started. My Aunt Sarah was less willing to discuss it at all. Whenever we brought up the voices, she would change the subject or suddenly remember something urgent we needed to do elsewhere in the cemetery. But I noticed she always hurried us along when we were in the children's section, never lingering the way she did at our parents' graves. The voices were always distant, but clear enough to know they were children. Sometimes they seemed to be playing games. We would hear laughter and what sounded like tag or hide and seek. Other times it was more like a conversation, though we could never make out specific words. The strangest part was how the voices would move, starting from one area and gradually shifting to another, as if the children were walking around while they talked. For almost 2 years, this was just an unsettling quirk of our cemetery visits. We learned to ignore the voices, to focus on why we were there and get through our time in the children's section as quickly as possible. Then came the visit that changed everything. It was February of 2006, during one of Northern California's rare cold snaps. My uncle's construction business had been struggling, and money was tight. We hadn't been to the cemetery in over 3 months, the longest gap since we'd started our regular visits. Uncle Robert felt guilty about the lapse and decided we needed to make a special trip to clean all the graves and make up for lost time. But he also had a potential job opportunity that day. A contractor wanted to meet with him about a large project. So he dropped the 4 of us off at the cemetery entrance with cleaning supplies and flowers, promising to return in 2 hours. The cemetery felt different that day, more deserted than usual. I don't think we saw a single other visitor the entire time we were there, which was unusual even for a weekday. The groundskeepers were nowhere to be seen, and even the birds seemed quieter than normal. We made quick work of our grandparents' section, then moved on to our parents' graves. What we found there shocked us. The graves were completely covered with debris, tree branches, leaves, and what looked like deliberate piles of cut brush. It was as if someone had been doing landscaping work and decided to dump all the trimmings on our family plot. "This is disrespectful," my older brother Marcus said angrily. "Who would do something like this?" We spent the better part of an hour clearing away the debris, uncovering headstones that looked like they hadn't been tended in years. The whole time, I kept checking my phone, knowing we were running out of time before Uncle Robert returned. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, and I could feel the first drops of rain starting to fall. That's when Uncle Robert called. "I'm running about 30 minutes late," he said. "This meeting is going really well. Can you guys hang tight?" I looked at my watch and realized we hadn't been to Emma's grave yet. "We still need to visit the children's section," I told my siblings. "You guys finish up here," I said. "I'll run over to Emma's grave real quick." The children's section felt more isolated than ever as I jogged toward it. The approaching storm had made the afternoon unnaturally dark, and the ocean wind was picking up, making the cypress trees sway and creak overhead. For the first time in all our visits, I didn't see any other people anywhere in the cemetery. When I reached Emma's grave, I was surprised to find it immaculate. Unlike our parents' neglected plot, her small headstone was clean, the surrounding grass was neatly trimmed, and there were even fresh flowers, daisies, that couldn't have been there more than a day or two. In fact, all the graves in the children's section looked recently maintained. Every headstone was clean, every plot was neatly tended. It was as if someone had been taking care of this area with special attention while letting the rest of the cemetery fall into neglect. I knelt beside Emma's grave and said a quick prayer, listening for the voices we always heard. They started right on schedule, children talking and laughing somewhere behind me. But this time I was alone, and the voices seemed louder, clearer. There was something different about them today. Usually, they sounded distant and indistinct, like conversation heard through a wall. But now I could almost make out individual words, and there seemed to be fewer voices. Maybe just 2 or 3 children instead of the usual crowd. Curiosity got the better of me. For years, we had wondered about those voices, and now I had a chance to finally solve the mystery. Instead of hurrying away like I usually did, I decided to investigate. The children's section ended at a low stone wall that marked the edge of the cemetery property. Beyond, that was the steep ravine Uncle Robert had always warned us about. I walked to the wall and peered over the edge. The ravine was deeper than I had expected, dropping away sharply into a tangle of scrub oak and poison ivy. But about 20 feet down the slope, partially hidden by the vegetation, I could see what looked like old stone markers, graves, that had apparently been outside the cemetery boundary. And sitting among those forgotten graves was an old man. He appeared to be in his 80s, wearing faded work clothes and a battered baseball cap. Around him sat 3 children, 2 girls who looked about 5 or 6 years old, and a boy who might have been 10 or 11. They were all facing toward me, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally look. The old man raised his hand and waved at me. Not a friendly greeting, but something else, a gesture that seemed to say, "Go away," or "You shouldn't be here." I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran back toward the main part of the cemetery, my heart pounding and my mind racing. There was something about that scene that felt fundamentally wrong, something that went beyond just finding trespassers in a restricted area. The children hadn't been moving or playing. They had been sitting perfectly still, staring in my direction with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And the old man, there had been something in his eyes, something that suggested he knew exactly who I was and why I was there. I found my siblings still working on our parents' graves and told Marcus what I had seen. He listened with skepticism until I described the children's appearance in detail. "That's impossible," he said. "There's no way down into that ravine. It's too steep." But when we returned to the cemetery 6 months later, I convinced Marcus to come with me to check on what I had seen. We walked to the stone wall and looked down into the ravine. The slope had partially collapsed, probably due to the heavy winter rains. The old graves I had seen were gone, tumbled down into the bottom of the ravine, along with tons of mud and debris. We could see fragments of old headstones scattered among the rocks and broken trees. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, "how long do you think those graves were down there?" I didn't have an answer. but I knew we wouldn't be hearing the children's voices anymore. Whatever had been holding them to that place was gone now, washed away by the winter storms and buried under tons of California hillside. We still visit the cemetery regularly, but the children's section is quiet now. Sometimes I miss those voices, strange as that might sound. They were proof that some part of us continues after death, that children who died too young might still find ways to play together. I like to think they've moved on to somewhere better, somewhere they don't need to hide in forgotten graves on the edge of a ravine. But sometimes, on windy days when the cypress trees are swaying, I swear I can still hear the faint echo of children's laughter carried on the ocean breeze. What happened to my family 25 years ago still defies explanation, and I've never heard anyone describe anything quite like it. It occurred during one of the most difficult times in our lives, when we were saying goodbye to my grandmother in a way that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. My grandmother, Alina, passed away in the spring of 1998 in our small community outside of Houston, Texas. She had been the heart of our extended family, the one who kept all the traditions alive and made sure everyone felt connected to their roots. Her death was expected. She had been battling cancer for almost 2 years, but that didn't make it any easier when the time finally came. In our community, wakes traditionally last for 2 full days and nights, with the deceased remaining in the family home until the burial. It's an old custom that allows everyone to say their goodbyes properly and provides comfort to the grieving family. Alina had specifically requested this arrangement, wanting to spend her final time surrounded by the people and places she loved most. On the evening of the first day, my cousins and I were sent to fetch water from a well about a 1/4 mile from the house. The area where we lived was rural, surrounded by thick woods and farmland, with our nearest neighbors at least 1/2 mile away. The well served several families in the area and required a bit of a walk through the forest to reach. There were 4 of us making the trip: myself, my cousin David, who was 16, my cousin Maria, who was 14, and my younger brother Carlos, who was only 12. We each carried large plastic containers, planning to make just one trip to bring back enough water for the evening and the next day. The sun was setting as we made our way along the familiar path through the woods. The forest was thick with pine trees and old oaks, creating a canopy that filtered the remaining daylight into patches of gold and shadow. It was the kind of peaceful evening walk we had made hundreds of times before. Nothing unusual or frightening about it. We reached the well just as full darkness was settling over the woods. While we were filling our containers, taking turns with the hand pump, we heard something that made us all stop and look up at the sky. It sounded like singing, but not quite like any singing I had ever heard before. The voices seemed to be coming from directly above us, maybe 50 or 60 feet up in the air. It was definitely human voices, multiple people singing together in what sounded like a hymn or prayer chant. But there was something strange about the quality of the sound. It wasn't muffled or distant like you might expect from voices carried on the wind. Instead, it was clear and resonant, as if the singers were standing right next to us, but somehow suspended in midair. We all looked up at the same time, scanning the darkening sky above the tree canopy. There was nothing there, no aircraft, no birds, no explanation for what we were hearing. The voices continued for maybe 30 or 40 seconds, a slow, melodic chanting that seemed to echo among the trees. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the singing stopped. The forest fell completely silent except for the usual sounds of insects and night birds beginning their evening chorus. "Did you guys hear that?" David whispered, though it was obvious we all had. Maria nodded, her eyes still fixed on the sky above us. Where did it come from? We stood there for several more minutes, listening and waiting to see if the voices would return. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of a Texas forest at night. "Maybe it's an airplane," Carlos suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "There's no airport around here," I said. "And did that sound like airplane noise to you?" We finished filling our containers quickly and headed back to the house, walking faster than usual and staying close together. The singing didn't return, but we all kept glancing up at the sky, half expecting to hear those mysterious voices again. When we arrived back at the house, we immediately told the adults what we had experienced. My mother and several of my aunts and uncles listened to our story with expressions that ranged from skeptical to concerned. "You sure it wasn't just the wind in the trees?" my Uncle Roberto asked. "Sound can play tricks on you in the woods, especially when you're already feeling emotional." But my Aunt Carmen, Alina's youngest daughter, had a different reaction. "We heard it too," she said quietly. "We were sitting on the back porch when it started, voices singing coming from somewhere up in the sky." My mother confirmed this. "It lasted maybe a minute, then stopped completely. We thought maybe it was coming from the direction of the church, but Father Miguel said there was no evening service tonight. The nearest church was over 3 miles away, far too distant for us to hear singing even on the stillest night. And this hadn't been the faint echo of distant music. It had been clear, immediate, and directly overhead." "What did it sound like to you?" I asked Aunt Carmen. She was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Like a funeral hymn," she said finally. "Like the songs we sing when someone is being called home." Over the next 2 days, as we continued the traditional wake, several other family members reported hearing similar phenomena. Always the same, voices singing hymns or prayers, always coming from above, always lasting for just a minute or two before fading away. My grandmother's funeral took place on the 3rd day at the old cemetery that served our community and several others in the surrounding area. It was a peaceful service, with about 60 people in attendance. Alina was laid to rest next to my grandfather, who had died 10 years earlier. But even at the cemetery, the strange occurrences continued. My older sister, Patricia, had chosen not to watch the actual burial. Instead, she walked away from the crowd to a hill that overlooked the entire cemetery, where she could see the service from a distance while having some privacy to grieve. According to Patricia, she was standing there alone when she noticed an elderly woman in a blue dress and black veil, watching the funeral from among the headstones. The woman was too far away for Patricia to see her face clearly, but something about her posture and the way she held herself seemed familiar. Patricia walked closer to get a better look, thinking perhaps it was an old friend of Alina's who hadn't felt comfortable joining the main group of mourners. But as she approached, she realized with shock that the woman looked exactly like our grandmother. It was Alina, Patricia told me years later, when she finally felt comfortable talking about what she had seen. "I know how crazy that sounds, but I could see her face clearly once I got close enough. She was watching her own funeral, standing there among the graves like she was just another visitor paying her respects. Patricia said she blinked hard and looked again, certain she must be mistaken. But the woman was still there, still watching the burial service with an expression of peaceful acceptance. Then, in the space of another blink, she was gone. Patricia searched the area thoroughly, but there was nowhere the woman could have hidden, no way she could have left the cemetery without being seen. I don't know what to make of these experiences, even 25 years later. Were we all hallucinating due to grief and stress? Was there some natural explanation for the voices we heard coming from the sky? Could Patricia have been mistaken about what she saw at the cemetery? Maybe, but I know what I heard that night by the well, and I know it wasn't wind or aircraft or any other conventional sound. Those were human voices, singing together in harmony, floating above the forest canopy like some kind of celestial choir. I've since learned that similar phenomena have been reported in various cultures throughout history. Mysterious voices heard during times of death and transition, apparitions of the deceased appearing at their own funerals. Some people interpret these as signs that the boundary between life and death is thinner than we usually believe, that our loved ones find ways to comfort us during our darkest hours. I choose to believe that Alina, in whatever form her consciousness took after death, was trying to let us know that she was at peace, that she was being welcomed into whatever comes next, with songs of joy and celebration. The voices we heard weren't frightening or ominous. They were beautiful, comforting, filled with a sense of homecoming. Sometimes, when I'm missing her particularly deeply, I go for walks in the woods near our old house. I listen for those voices, hoping to hear again that celestial choir that sang my grandmother home. I never have, but the memory of that night remains as clear and vivid as if it happened yesterday. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the gift wasn't in the mysterious voices themselves, but in the knowledge they gave us that death is not an ending, but a transformation, not a departure, but a different kind of arrival. In a world full of uncertainty and loss, that's a comfort worth treasuring. It was 6 years ago when everything started happening at Riverside Cemetery in upstate New York. My father had been visiting my grandfather's grave religiously every month since he passed. But there was something different about that particular October visit, the one that fell on the anniversary of Grandpa's death. The cemetery was one of those old Victorian ones, filled with elaborate headstones and weathered monuments from the 1800s. Grandpa's grave sat right next to the famous General Morrison Memorial, a towering bronze bust that locals swore sometimes whispered to visitors in the dead of night. I always thought those were just small-town legends, but after what happened to my father, I'm not so sure anymore. Dad arrived that crisp October evening just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the headstones. He brought fresh chrysanthemums, Grandpa's favorite, and spent time cleaning the granite marker, pulling weeds, and arranging everything just so. Then he knelt down to pray, as he always did, completely absorbed in his quiet conversation with the man who had raised him. That's when he noticed them approaching down the gravel path, 5 figures walking in a loose formation. 2 men led the group, followed by 2 more, and trailing behind them all was an elderly woman in a dark coat. As they got closer, Dad realized he recognized the man in front. It was his brother Michael, my uncle, accompanied by his longtime friend Robert from the lodge. Dad waved and called out a greeting, then returned to his prayers, assuming they had come to pay their respects as well. He could hear the group settling somewhere behind him, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. At one point, he distinctly heard one of the unknown men encouraging the elderly woman to join them closer to the grave. But she declined with what sounded like a firm shake of her head. When Dad finished his prayers and stood to properly greet his brother, he was startled to find only Michael and Robert standing there. The other two men and the woman had completely vanished, no footsteps retreating, no car doors slamming, nothing. "Where did your friends go?" Dad asked as they walked toward the parking area. Michael looked confused. "What friends? It's just been Robert and me this whole time." Dad insisted he had seen and heard 3 other people with them, describing the elderly woman in detail and mentioning the conversation he'd overheard. But both Michael and Robert swore they had been alone the entire time. They seemed genuinely puzzled by Dad's account, which was impossible. They had been standing much closer to the other visitors than Dad had been. 3 months later, Dad returned to the cemetery alone. It was a gray February afternoon, and the place felt different somehow, heavier, more watchful. He was kneeling at Grandpa's grave when he sensed someone approaching. Looking up, he saw the same elderly woman from October, standing directly in front of him. This time she spoke. "You come to visit your dead," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Dad replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you come for the same reason?" The woman nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Yes, but my time here is almost finished. I won't be coming much longer." Dad felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. He murmured something sympathetic and lowered his head to continue praying. When he looked up again just seconds later, she was gone. He searched the entire cemetery that day, walking every path and checking behind every monument. There was no sign of her anywhere, and no way she could have left the grounds so quickly without him hearing her footsteps on the gravel. Dad never saw her again, but he still visits Grandpa's grave every month. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when the shadows grow long, he says he can feel eyes watching him from somewhere among the headstones. He's never been able to shake the feeling that the woman, whoever or whatever she was, is still there, waiting for something or someone, before her time at Riverside Cemetery finally comes to an end. During my junior year at the University of Colorado, I was working 3 different jobs to help pay for my astrophysics degree and save money for a semester abroad program in Germany. The workload was brutal, but I was determined to make it happen without putting more financial strain on my parents. One of those jobs came through a connection. My father's old high school friend ran a security company and offered me overnight shifts covering for regular guards who needed time off. The pay was decent, and he promised me I'd get assignments where I could catch some sleep between patrols. Most of the time, he was true to his word. I'd get stationed at office buildings, warehouses, or small factories where nothing ever happened. I'd do a quick walkthrough every few hours and spend the rest of the night dozing in a chair. But one night in late October, everything changed. "I've got something different for you tonight," my father's friend told me as we sat in his office that evening. "It's a bit of a drive, about 45 minutes outside Boulder, up in the foothills. I'll have to drive you there and pick you up in the morning since there's no bus service that far out." "What kind of place?" I asked. He hesitated, drumming his fingers on his desk. Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery. Private cemetery, serves some of the wealthier families in the area. They've been having some problems. Vandalism, grave desecration. The kind of thing that's got the families who have relatives buried there pretty upset. They hired us to provide extra security overnight, in addition to their regular groundskeeper. Something in his tone made me uneasy. What kind of desecration? He looked out the window at the darkening sky. Graves have been disturbed, not just surface vandalism. Some of the burial sites have been actually opened up. The groundskeeper is an older guy, been there 15 years, and everyone's wondering if he's letting people in after hours, or if someone's climbing the fence. You think he's involved? I've worked with him before. Good man, honest as they come. But someone's getting in there, and it's happening on a regular basis. The strange thing is, the cemetery is in the middle of nowhere, no houses for miles, just forest. Whoever's doing this is either walking a long way down a mountain road at night, or they're coming through the woods. The drive up to Hillcrest Memorial took us along increasingly narrow roads that wound through dense pine forest. The last 10 miles were on a gravel road that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into the wilderness. When we finally arrived, I understood why someone might choose this location for a cemetery. It was peaceful and secluded, surrounded by towering pines and aspen trees that had turned golden in the fall weather. The groundskeeper, a man named Frank who looked to be in his early 60s, met us at the front gate. He had a weathered face and kind eyes, and he welcomed me with genuine warmth, offering coffee and homemade cookies his wife had packed for him. I've been sleeping a lot better since your company started sending people up here, he told me as we sat in the small maintenance building near the entrance. This place never bothered me during the day, but nights are different up here. My father's friend finished his coffee and prepared to head back down the mountain. I'll be back at 7 a.m. sharp, he told me. Frank will show you around, but honestly, there's not much to patrol. Just try to stay alert. After he left, Frank gave me a brief tour of the grounds. Hillcrest Memorial was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 200 graves spread across a hillside that sloped down toward a creek at the bottom. Most of the headstones were newer granite markers, though there were some older sections with more elaborate monuments from the early 1900s. You can stay in the office if you want, Frank said, handing me a heavy-duty flashlight. I do a patrol every couple hours, but to be honest, if someone's determined to get in here, they'll find a way. The fence isn't that high, and there's miles of forest on 3 sides. I settled into a chair across from Frank and tried to stay awake, but the combination of my other jobs and the long drive caught up with me. I dozed off sometime after midnight and woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of wind rattling the office windows. Frank was asleep in his chair, snoring softly. I picked up the flashlight and decided to do a patrol, partly to stay awake and partly out of curiosity. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The moment I stepped outside, I understood why this place felt different at night. There's something about a cemetery, illuminated only by flashlight beam, that triggers every primal fear buried in your DNA. The shadows seemed to move between the headstones, and every gust of wind sounded like whispered voices. I started walking along the main path that ran down the center of the cemetery. But somehow I took a wrong turn and found myself on a side path I hadn't noticed during the daylight tour. The path curved to the left and began sloping downward more steeply than I remembered. Soon I was walking among headstones I definitely hadn't seen before, older ones, more weathered, some dating back to the 1890s. I realized I was in a section of the cemetery that Frank hadn't shown me, possibly because it wasn't part of the regular maintenance area. The path kept descending, and through the beam of my flashlight, I could see rows of graves extending down the hillside much farther than I'd thought possible. That's when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere below me, deeper in the cemetery where the flashlight beam couldn't reach. At first I thought it might be an animal, a coyote, or maybe an injured deer. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be random animal sounds. I had two choices: call out and potentially scare away whatever was down there, or turn off my flashlight and try to approach quietly to see what was actually happening. The first option seemed dangerous if I was dealing with vandals who might be armed. So I switched off the flashlight and began moving carefully down the slope, using the dim starlight to navigate between the headstones. I hadn't gone far when I saw it. Between two large monuments, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was thin, unnaturally so, and appeared to be naked. Long hair hung down around its shoulders, and it was hunched over one of the graves, making that strange sound I'd been hearing, not quite human, but not animal either. Every rational part of my brain told me to back away slowly and get Frank, but my body seemed to have other ideas. Almost without thinking, I picked up a piece of broken stone from a damaged headstone and threw it as hard as I could. The stone hit the figure square in the back with a solid thud. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The thing let out a shriek that sounded like metal scraping against concrete and whipped around to face me. In the faint starlight, I could see its eyes reflecting like an animal's, but where its mouth should have been was just smooth skin. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, then turned and ran off into the darkness with an unnatural, loping gait that covered ground faster than any human could move. I ran back to the office, probably setting a new land speed record for uphill cemetery navigation in the dark. Frank woke up as soon as I burst through the door, and we spent the rest of the night locked inside, waiting for dawn. When the sun came up, Frank and I walked back to where I'd had my encounter. We found the spot easily enough. There was a piece of broken headstone on the ground that matched what I'd thrown, and the grave the figure had been hunched over showed signs of disturbance. Part of the headstone had been broken off, not with tools but apparently with bare hands, judging by the jagged edges and scattered fragments. If you report what you actually saw, they'll think you're crazy, Frank told me as we walked back toward the office. Trust me on this one. Just say we spotted someone trespassing and scared them off. That's exactly what we did when my ride arrived that morning. I never worked another cemetery assignment, and I never asked to go back to Hillcrest Memorial. But sometimes I think about Frank, still up there doing his rounds, still keeping watch over that remote hillside full of graves. I wonder if he's seen that thing again, if it's still out there in the woods waiting for the right moment to return. And I wonder what it was trying to do to that grave, what it wanted badly enough to risk showing itself to the living. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when the truth might be more terrifying than any explanation you could imagine. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.